November 29th, 1872. Cold rain mixed with sleet lashed against the dark blue wool coats of 38 troopers from the 1st Cavalry as they rode south through the darkness, intent on crushing a defiance that had festered in the Oregon-California borderlands for too long. Major James Jackson sat stiffly in his saddle, his eyes fixed on the muddy track ahead, leading his men from Fort Klamath toward the icy waters of the Lost River. The horses breathed heavy plumes of steam into the freezing night air, their hooves churning the saturated earth into a slurry of black mud that coated the boots and stirrups of the riders. Every man in the column knew the orders were to arrest the Modoc leader Kentpoos, known to the settlers as Captain Jack, and force his band of followers back to the reservation they had fled in disgust months prior. The troopers checked their weapons repeatedly, shielding the breeches of their Springfield carbines from the driving precipitation, knowing that a wet cartridge could mean a jam at the moment violence erupted. They rode not with the fanfare of a parade, but with the grim silence of men moving into position to spring a trap on a sleeping village. The column navigated through the brush and scrub oak, the landscape flattening out as they approached the river valley where the Modoc winter camp lay situated on the west bank. It was just before dawn, the sky a bruised purple bruising into gray, offering barely enough light to distinguish the shapes of the traditional earth lodges and canvas tents clustered near the water's edge. Jackson signaled for the deployment and the troopers fanned out, forming a skirmish line that effectively boxed the sleeping camp against the river. The maneuver was executed with the heavy clanking noise of sabers and equipment, intentionally loud enough now to wake the inhabitants and announce the military presence. Dogs within the camp began to bark, a cacophony that ripped through the morning silence, followed by the rustling of buffalo robes and blankets as the Modoc people roused from sleep to find a wall of armed soldiers staring down at them. Kentpoos emerged from his lodge, his face set in a hard line, showing no sign of the fear the soldiers expected to see. He stood wrapped in a blanket, his dark eyes scanning the line of cavalrymen, assessing the threat with the cold calculation of a man who had anticipated this day. Major Jackson rode forward, his voice cutting through the damp air, demanding Kentpoos surrender himself and his people immediately for transport back to the Klamath Reservation. The Modoc leader refused, his voice steady, stating he had no intention of returning to a place where his people were starved and harassed by the Klamath tribe, while agents turned a blind eye. The standoff stretched on, the tension thick enough to choke the breath from the lungs of the young privates gripping their carbines with white-knuckled intensity. Other Modoc men began to emerge, clutching rifles and pistols, moving to position themselves behind the cover of the lodges and wagons. Lieutenant Fraser Boutelle commanded the left flank of the cavalry line, his patience thinning as the verbal sparring continued without resolution. He fixed his gaze on a warrior known as Scar-Faced Charlie, who stood brazenly in front of a lodge, a rifle resting easily in his hands. The two men locked eyes, an unspoken challenge passing between them that transcended the political posturing of their superiors. Words were exchanged, sharp and biting, stripped of diplomatic veneer. Boutelle ordered Charlie to put down his weapon. Charlie retorted that he was not a dog to be ordered and that he would keep his gun. The air between them seemed to vibrate with the potential for violence, every other sound in the valley fading into the background as the focus narrowed to the barrels of their respective weapons. Boutelle drew his revolver, the metallic click of the hammer cocking echoing like a thunderclap in the stillness. He shouted that he would shoot if the weapon was not dropped. Scar-Faced Charlie did not flinch, his grip tightening on his rifle stock, his finger finding the trigger guard. He replied that he would shoot back. It was a promise, not a threat. In a single fluid motion, Boutelle raised his pistol and fired. The bullet tore through the sleeve of Charlie's shirt, grazing the skin but failing to incapacitate him. Almost simultaneously, Charlie's rifle roared, the muzzle flash cutting through the gloom. His round struck Boutel's sleeve, mimicking the injury he had just received, a near-miraculous exchange of near misses that served as the signal for absolute chaos to unleash itself upon the lost river. The skirmish line erupted in a volley of carbine fire, the heavy 50-70 caliber slugs tearing through the canvas tents and thudding into the earth lodges. The noise was deafening, a continuous roar of black, powder explosions that instantly filled the valley with thick, acrid white smoke. Modoc warriors returned fire with a mix of muzzle loaders and repeating rifles, the diverse cracks and booms of their weaponry adding to the din. Horses reared and screamed, throwing inexperienced riders into the mud while officers shouted orders that were instantly swallowed by the cacophony of battle. The discipline of the cavalry line wavered as the return fire proved more accurate and ferocious than anticipated, forcing troopers to seek cover behind trees and fallen logs, the engagement devolving into a disorganized, close-quarters shootout. Inside the camp, the scene was one of terrified scrambling as women and children dropped to the ground, crawling desperately toward the riverbank. Bullets shredded the air above them, splintering the wood of the lodges and kicking up geysers of wet dirt. Kientpus directed his men, shouting commands to hold the line just long enough to buy time for the families to reach the canoes. He moved from cover to cover, firing his rifle with precision, his presence anchoring the defense even as the military volume of fire threatened to overwhelm them. A trooper collapsed, a red stain blossoming rapidly across the chest of his uniform, his breath rattling in his throat as he clawed at the mud. Another soldier took a round to the leg, the bone shattering under the impact, his scream piercing the veil of gunfire. Across the river on the east bank, a second drama unfolded that would seal the fate of the conflict. A group of local citizens, armed settlers who had gathered to assist the army, launched their own assault on a smaller Modoc camp led by Hooker Jim. Unlike the military operation, which retained a veneer of tactical objective, this attack descended rapidly into indiscriminate violence. The settlers fired blindly into the structures, caring little for who lay inside. Panic seized the East Bank camp as inhabitants fled into the brush, chased by the whizzing of bullets fired by men they had traded with only days before. The betrayal was absolute, severing any lingering trust between the Modoc and the local population. Back on the West Bank, the Modoc warriors began a fighting retreat toward the water. They moved with a fluidity born of intimate knowledge of the terrain, using every dip in the ground and cluster of sagebrush to shield their movements. The soldiers pressed forward, sensing the withdrawal, but paid a heavy price for every yard of ground gained. One soldier leaning out to fire was struck in the head, his body crumpling instantly like a marionette with cut strings. The mud around the camp became slick with blood, the rain failing to wash it away fast enough, creating a gruesome slush that the combatants slipped and slid through. The women and children reached the canoes, pushing the hollowed-out logs into the freezing current of the lost river. They paddled frantically, the water around them churning as stray. Bullets slapped the surface. The warriors covered their escape, firing final volleys that kept the cavalry heads down just long enough for the boats to reach the center of the stream. Kientpus was among the last to leave the shore, his face a mask of fury and resolve. He knew that the bridge back to peace had been burned, not by his hand, but by the arrogance of the men now shooting at his family. Major Jackson, realizing the Modocs were slipping away, ordered his men to concentrate fire on the retreating canoes, but the fog and smoke obscured the targets. The troopers fired blindly into the mist, their frustration mounting as the enemy vanished into the gray expanse of the river and the marshlands beyond. The ceasefire order finally came, not because victory was achieved, but because there was no one left to shoot at. The silence that followed was heavy and oppressive, broken only by the moans of the wounded and the steady drum of rain on the sodden earth. The soldiers moved cautiously into the abandoned camp, checking the lodges with weapons drawn, but found them empty of combatants. They found only the remnants of a hastily evacuated life, cooking pots still warm, blankets scattered in disarray and the bodies of the few Modocs who had not made it to the water. The smell of burnt powder hung low in the valley, mixing with the metallic scent of blood and the wet wool of the uniforms. Jackson surveyed the scene, his expression grim. He had lost men, 1 killed instantly, 7 wounded, some mortally, and he had failed to capture Kintpus. The mission was a disaster. On the east bank, the survivors of Hooker Jim's camp scattered into the wilderness, their hearts hardening into stones of hatred. They had seen family members gunned down by neighbors, an act of treachery that demanded blood in return. Hooker Jim, a man of volatile temper and fierce pride, rallied the survivors not toward the reservation but toward the open country where isolated ranches lay vulnerable. The seeds of a brutal retaliation were sown in the mud of the riverbank, watered by the blood of the innocent and the guilty alike. Kintpus guided the flotilla of canoes through the winding channels of the Tule Lake Marsh, heading south toward the jagged horizon of the lava beds. He knew the terrain there, a hellish landscape of twisted volcanic rock, caves and fissures where a small number of men could hold off an army. It was a place the Modoc called the land of burnt-out fires, a natural fortress that the white soldiers would find impenetrable. As he paddled, the sounds of the battle fading behind him, he began to formulate a plan not just for survival but for war. The cavalry troopers tended to their wounded, tearing strips of cloth from shirts to bind shattered limbs and plugging bullet holes. The journey back to Fort Klamath would be a slow, agonizing procession of misery. The rain turned to snow as the temperature dropped further, freezing the mud on their coats into hard, cracking shells. They loaded the dead onto pack horses, the bodies lashed down under tarps, a grim reminder of the cost of the morning's work. The confidence that had buoyed them on the ride out had evaporated, replaced by a sullen realization that they had kicked a hornet's nest. News of the fight spread rapidly, carried by riders to the outlying settlements. Panic ignited like wildfire across the basin. Ranchers barred their doors and loaded their weapons, scanning the tree lines for shadows. The illusion of safety that had allowed the settlements to encroach on Modoc land was shattered. The telegraph lines hummed with reports to Department of Columbia headquarters, detailing the engagement and requesting reinforcements. The army machine began to grind into motion, responding to the sting of the defeat with the slow, inevitable gathering of overwhelming force. In the days that followed, the weather worsened, blanketing the region in a thick layer of snow that hid the tracks of the retreating Modoc bands. This worked to Kintpus's advantage, covering his movement as he consolidated his people in the lava beds. He sent runners to other scattered groups, calling them to the stronghold. They came, bringing weapons, ammunition, and cattle, moving like ghosts through the white landscape. They were no longer a disparate collection of families. They were a besieged nation digging in for a fight to the death. The failure at Lost River also exposed the deep rifts in the chain of command and the intelligence failures of the local military leadership. Jackson's report tried to paint the engagement as a necessary action to suppress an uprising, but the casualty numbers told a different story. The army had been outmaneuvered and outfought by a force they considered inferior. The humiliation stung the pride of the officer corps, ensuring that the next engagement would not be a mere policing action, but a full-scale military campaign designed to crush the resistance utterly. Meanwhile, Hooker Jim's band moved through the ranchlands, exacting a terrible price for the attack on their camp. They moved swiftly, striking isolated homesteads, leaving behind smoke and bodies. This was not the strategic warfare of Kintpus, but the raw lash of vengeance. Each raid added to the terror gripping the territory, creating a political pressure cooker that demanded the army exterminate the Modoc threat entirely. The distinction between the aggressive actions of Hooker Jim and the defensive posture of Kintpus was lost on the white population. To them, All Modocs were now enemies to be hunted down. As November bled into December, the lava beds transformed from a geological curiosity into a fortress of war. The Modocs fortified the natural caves, creating firing slits and stockpiling water and dried meat. They knew every crevice, every tunnel, and every vantage point. They prepared to face a nation that possessed endless soldiers and cannons armed only with their rifles and their knowledge of the stone. Kentpu stood on the rim of the stronghold, looking out over the frozen lake and the flat sagebrush plains beyond, watching for the blue coats he knew would come. He understood that the first shot fired by Boutel had not just started a skirmish but had ignited a war that would burn until one side was ashes. November 30th, 1872. The sun rose cold and pale over the basin, illuminating a landscape that had fundamentally changed overnight. The air remained biting, carrying the sharp scent of wet sage and the lingering smoke from the skirmish at Lost River. While Kientpus and the main body of the Modoc people navigated the freezing marshes toward the sanctuary of the lava beds, a different, darker energy coalesced on the east side of the river. The smaller band of Modocs, those who had been attacked by the citizen militia rather than the uniformed cavalry, gathered their scattered numbers in the scrub brush. They were wet, freezing and vibrating with a rage that eclipsed any thought of strategic retreat. Among them stood Hooker Jim, a man whose face was twisted into a mask of pure animosity. Beside him were curly-headed Doctor, the spiritual leader whose medicine kept the warriors emboldened, and Boston Charlie, whose complexion was lighter but whose resolve was just as hardened. They had not been given the chance to parley or refuse surrender. They had been fired upon by men they knew by name, men they had worked for and traded with in the seasons past. The betrayal stripped away the thin veneer of civilization that had existed between the two cultures, leaving only the raw, primal urge for retribution. Hooker Jim looked at the shivering women and children of his band, seeing the fear in their eyes that quickly turned to expectancy as they looked to the men for protection and vengeance. He checked the action of his rifle, the metal cold against his skin, and made a decision that would alter the complexion of the entire conflict. They would not simply flee to the stronghold to hide. They would cut a path of destruction on their way to join Kientpus. The targets were not the soldiers who were miles away tending to their wounded, but the settlers who lived on the scattered ranches along the north and east shores of Tool Lake. These were the people who had called for the army, the people who had encroached on the grazing lands, and the people whose neighbors had pulled triggers on the east bank only hours before. The band began to move, 14 men peeling away from the families to form a raiding party, while the non-combatants began the slow trek south toward the rendezvous point. By the afternoon of November 29th and into the 30th, the raiding party reached the ranch of the Body family. William Body had been one of the settlers who had not participated in the attack, a man who believed he had a peaceful understanding with the local tribes. He was out in the timber gathering firewood, unaware that the political landscape had shifted so violently. Hooker Jim and his men approached him not with the stealth of hunters, but with the brazen confidence of executioners. They shot him down where he stood, the report of the rifles rolling across the open fields. He fell into the dirt, his life ending before he could comprehend the reason for the violence. The warriors did not pause to mourn or reflect. They stripped the body of weapons and ammunition, the practical necessities of the war they were now waging. The party moved toward the Body house where William's stepson, Nicholas Shearer, was working. He saw the Modocs approaching and, recognizing them, offered no immediate resistance, likely assuming they were passing through or seeking news. The realization of their intent came too late. A volley of gunfire cut him down near the barn. The women inside the house, hearing the shots, barred the doors and huddled in terror, listening to the shouts and the heavy footsteps circling their home. However, the Modoc warriors, adhering to a specific code of warfare even in their rage, did not breach the house to harm the women. They focused their fury solely on the adult males, the potential combatants and heads of the households. They took horses, supplies, and guns, leaving the grieving women to the silence of the aftermath. They rode on, the adrenaline of the kill fueling their momentum. The next target was the Brotherton Ranch, located several miles further along the lake shore. The news of the Lost River fight had not yet reached these isolated homesteads, leaving the settlers completely exposed. Dennis Brotherton and two herders were working with their stock when the Modoc party descended upon them. The open terrain offered no cover, and the three men were gunned down in rapid succession. The brutality was efficient and impersonal. The warriors were not torturing their victims, they were eliminating them. Each death was a message, a tangible strike against the encroachment that had squeezed their people for decades. The bodies were left where they fell, stark reminders against the gray earth. As the sun began to dip lower, casting long, distorted shadows across the valley, the raiding party continued their grim circuit. They reached the Miller Ranch where they found another group of unsuspecting men. The pattern repeated itself with terrifying consistency. The crack of rifles, the thud of bodies hitting the ground, the terrified stampede of livestock. By the time the sun set, the body count had risen significantly. Depending on the specific accounts, between 14 and 18 male settlers lay dead across the Tool Lake Basin. The smoke from burning haystacks began to rise into the darkening sky, distinct black pillars marking the progress of Hooker Jim's vengeance. The psychological impact of these killings was immediate and devastating once word began to spread. The first survivors, the women from the Body Ranch, fled toward the nearest settlements, their hysterical accounts painting a picture of a wholesale massacre. Panic swept through the region with more speed and intensity than the initial news of the army's defeat. Settlers who had spent the previous day debating the merits of the reservation system were now loading wagons in a frenzy, abandoning their homes and livestock to flee toward the safety of Linkville or Eureka. The roads became clogged with refugees, creating a chaotic exodus that hampered military movement and added to the general confusion. The narrative of the war shifted instantly from a military police action to a fight for survival against a perceived savage horde. While Hooker Jim's band exacted their price in blood, Kientpoos and the main group reached the lava beds. The transition from the marshlands to the volcanic fields was stark. The ground turned from soft, yielding mud to hard, razor-sharp rock. The horses picked their way carefully over the uneven surface, their iron shoes ringing against the stone. Kientpoos guided them deep into the heart of the formation, to a place where the earth had collapsed into a series of natural trenches, caves, and ridges formed by ancient lava flows. This was the stronghold. It was a natural fortress, a geological anomaly that offered perfect cover and seemingly infinite firing positions. The wind howled over the jagged rocks, but down in the crevices the air was still and protected. The families began to unload the pack horses and establish a camp within the stone maze. They found caves that could serve as sleeping quarters, natural depressions that could corral the cattle, and fissures that held pools of ice and water. Kientpoos moved among his people, his face grave. He directed the placement of sentries, positioning men at high points that offered commanding views of the approaches from the north and west. He knew the army would follow, but he also believed that if he could hold out, if he could make the cost of removing them too high, the government might grant them the small piece of land they desired on the Lost River. His strategy was defensive. He wanted to be left alone. The arrival of Hooker Jim's band 2 days later shattered that strategy. The raiding party rode into the stronghold, their horses lathered, their saddlebags heavy with looted ammunition and goods. They brought with them the women and children of their band, increasing the number of mouths to feed, but also adding experienced rifles to the defense. However, they also brought the undeniable guilt of the settler murders. Kintpoos met Hooker Jim near the center of the camp, the tension between the two leaders palpable. Kintpoos listened as Hooker Jim recounted the raids, the killing of the men, and the burning of the ranches. Kintpoos was furious. He understood that the army's attack on him was an act of war, but the murder of unarmed settlers changed the moral calculus of their resistance. He knew that the white society would never forgive the killing of civilians. Hooker Jim had removed the possibility of a negotiated peace that did not involve trials and hangings. The army would not just come to arrest them now, they would come to exterminate them. Kintpoos berated Hooker Jim, calling him a fool for bringing such heat down upon the entire tribe. Hooker Jim, unrepentant, countered that the white men were all the same, that the settlers were the ones who had stolen their land and called for their removal. He challenged Kintpoos's leadership, implying that a true war chief would have done the same. The argument did not split the tribe physically, but it created a fracture in the command structure that would fester in the weeks to come. Despite his anger, Kintpoos could not turn them away. They were Modoc, they were kin, and practically he needed their guns. The combined force now numbered roughly 53 warriors, along with over 100 women, children, and elderly. They were surrounded by miles of hostile territory, with an angry nation mobilizing against them. Kintpoos accepted the reality of his situation. He integrated Hooker Jim's men into the defensive perimeter, assigning them sectors of the lava beds to guard. The distinct bands merged into a single fighting force, bound together by the rock walls of their fortress and the knowledge that surrender was no longer an option. As December deepened, the weather turned colder. Snow dusted the black rocks of the lava beds, creating a high-contrast landscape where movement was easily spotted. The Modocs worked tirelessly to improve their positions. They built breastworks of loose stone, piling rocks to close off gaps and create small forts within the larger fortress. They wove ropes from the native tool reeds, cleared firing lanes, and scouted the few trails that led into the labyrinth. The women worked to prepare food stores, drying the meat from the cattle they had brought, rationing the supplies with strict discipline. Water was the primary concern. Tool Lake was close, but accessing it meant crossing open ground that would soon be watched by army patrols. They relied on the ice that formed in the deep caves, harvesting it carefully to melt for drinking. Outside the stronghold, the United States Army was reeling from the shock and trying to organize a response. The reports of the settler massacres had reached the newspapers in San Francisco and Portland, igniting a public outcry for blood. The military district commander, General Edward Canby, ordered all available troops to the region. Reinforcements began the long march from forts in Washington, Oregon, and California. Infantry, cavalry, and artillery units were mobilized. They moved slowly, hampered by the winter storms and the difficult terrain. But they moved with the inexorable weight of an industrial power. Colonel Frank Wheaton took command of the field operations, establishing headquarters at Van Bremer's ranch to the west of the lava beds. He began to probe the Modoc defenses, sending out scouting parties to determine the exact location and strength of the enemy. These patrols found the terrain to be a nightmare. The lava field was a broken, chaotic jumble of sharp stones that shredded boots and crippled horses. Deep chasms appeared out of nowhere, and the ridges blocked lines of sight, making communication difficult. The soldiers felt exposed and vulnerable as they approached the dark mass of the stronghold, sensing eyes watching them from the shadows. One such patrol, venturing too close to the perimeter in late December, was met with a sudden, precise volley of rifle fire. 2 troopers were wounded before they even saw an enemy. They retreated hastily, dragging their injured comrades back to safety. The engagement was small, but it confirmed what the army feared. The Modocs were dug in, they were well armed, and they were not going to run. The Modoc War had officially transitioned from a pursuit into a siege. Inside the stronghold, the mood was a mix of grim determination and fatalism. The warriors spent their days cleaning their weapons and watching the horizon. They knew the army was gathering. They could see the dust clouds from the supply wagons in the distance and the smoke from the soldiers' campfires at night. Scar-faced Charlie, the man who had fired the first shot at Lost River, became one of the key field commanders. He walked the perimeter, checking on the young sentries, offering advice on sight lines and cover. He told them to conserve their ammunition, to make every shot count. He reminded them that they were fighting for their lives, for their families huddled in the caves behind them. The divide between Kintpoos and the aggressive faction led by Hooker Jim and curly-headed Doctor remained, but it was suppressed by the immediate external threat. Curly-headed Doctor held ceremonies in the caves, dancing and chanting, raising a red rope which he claimed would protect the warriors from the soldiers' bullets. The younger men, terrified of the overwhelming odds, clung to these superstitions, finding courage in the belief that their cause had supernatural protection. Kintpoos watched these rituals with a skeptical eye, relying instead on the thickness of the rock and the sharpness of his tactical mind. By mid-January, the army had amassed a force of over 300 men surrounding the lava beds on the landward sides. They brought with them 2 mountain howitzers, small cannons designed to be disassembled and carried by mules. The soldiers were confident. They outnumbered the Modoc warriors 6-1. They had superior weaponry, unlimited ammunition, and the backing of the government. They viewed the Modocs as a ragtag group of savages trapped in a hole. They did not understand the terrain, and they did not understand the desperation of the men they were facing. The stage was set for the first major assault. The soldiers checked their equipment, wrote letters home, and speculated on how quickly the fight would be over. Inside the rocks, the Modocs waited. They had nowhere else to go. The frozen shores of Tool Lake, once a place of seasonal harvest and peace, had become the boundary of their world, a line drawn in blood that they would defend until the end. The silence of the high desert winter hung heavy over the lava beds, a deceptive calm before the storm that was about to break against the black stones. The waiting was the hardest part, the slow ticking of time as the inevitable violence drew closer with every passing hour. January 16th, 1873. The dawn broke with a deceptive clarity over the Van Bremer Ranch, the staging ground for the United States Army's operations against the Modoc stronghold. Lieutenant Colonel Frank Wheaton stood outside his command tent, observing the hive of activity as over 300 men prepared to move out. The air was frigid, the temperature hovering near freezing, biting at the exposed skin of the soldiers as they broke down their encampments. Wheaton held a confidence born of conventional military logic. He possessed superior numbers, superior firepower, and a tactical plan that looked flawless on the maps spread across his field desk. His objective was simple: advance upon the lava beds from the west and east simultaneously, crush the small band of resistance in a pincer movement, and end the conflict in a single day of decisive action. He did not view the coming engagement as a battle so much as a final police action, a necessary exertion of force to restore order to the district. The force under his command was a composite mix of regular army troops and volunteer militia, a blend that brought both discipline and unpredictability to the field. The regulars, men of the 1st Cavalry and the 21st Infantry, moved with practiced efficiency, checking their equipment and saddling their mounts with a silent, grim professionalism. They wore the standard-issue dark blue sack coats and sky blue trousers, uniforms that stood out starkly against the gray and brown palette of the high desert. The volunteers, comprised of men from Oregon and California, were a more boisterous lot, eager to settle the score for the settler killings. They checked their personal rifles and boasted loudly about the quick work they would make of the Modocs once they got within range. This mix of grim duty and vengeance-fueled bravado created a palpable energy in the camp, a surging forward momentum that masked the underlying anxieties of the individual men. Wheaton divided his force into two primary columns to execute the encirclement. Major John Greene commanded the western force, the larger of the two, tasked with pushing directly against the front of the stronghold. Captain Reuben Bernard led the eastern detachment, which had to navigate a wide arc around the lava beds to cut off any potential escape route toward the lake. The coordination required for such a maneuver was complex, relying on visual signals and runners in terrain that ate up time and stamina. The officers shouted orders, their voices carrying far in the thin air, directing the loading of the supply wagons and the harnessing of the mules. The army was a heavy, lumbering beast, requiring tons of fodder, ammunition, and rations to keep moving, a stark contrast to the agile, light-traveling enemy they sought to destroy. The pride of the expedition, and the source of much of the soldiers' confidence, were the two mountain howitzers attached to the western column. These bronze cannons, capable of firing 12-pound explosive shells, were designed to be disassembled and carried on the backs of mules through rough terrain. The artillerymen treated the weapons with reverence, polishing the barrels and carefully packing the crates of shells. The general belief among the rank and file was that the mere sound of the cannons would be enough to shatter the Modoc resolve. They expected the high explosive rounds to blast the warriors out of their rock crevices, turning their natural fortress into a trap of flying stone and shrapnel. The logic was sound for a conventional siege against a static fortification, but the lava beds were unlike any fort the army had ever besieged. By mid-morning, the columns were in motion, leaving the relative comfort of the ranch behind. The march began on hard-packed dirt trails that allowed for a steady pace, the rhythmic tramp of boots and the clatter of hooves creating a low rumble that vibrated through the ground. However, as they drew closer to the southern shore of Tool Lake, the terrain began to change drastically. The flat sagebrush plains gave way to the broken, chaotic geology of the lava flows. The ground became uneven, littered with loose stones that rolled underfoot, twisting ankles and causing horses to stumble. The wagons, initially moving with ease, now lurched and groaned as their iron-rimmed wheels slammed against hidden ridges of basalt. The drivers cursed and cracked their whips, urging the struggling teams forward, but the pace slowed to a crawl. The soldiers on foot found the marching increasingly difficult. The lava rock was not smooth, it was sharp, abrasive, and unforgiving. It chewed through the leather soles of their boots, leaving their feet bruised and blistered. Every step required attention, a constant scanning of the ground to avoid deep fissures that opened up like wounds in the earth. These cracks, some only a few feet wide but dozens of feet deep, were treacherous traps for the unwary. A man could slip and vanish into the darkness below in the blink of an eye. The formation loosened as the men picked their own paths through the obstacles, the neat lines of the parade ground dissolving into a ragged stream of blue struggling over the black rock. Major Greene pushed his men forward, his eyes fixed on the distant bluff that marked the western edge of the stronghold. From 3 miles away, the Modoc position looked deceptively flat, a low plateau rising gently from the lakeshore. It offered no towering walls or clear battlements, just a rugged expanse of stone that seemed to merge with the horizon. This visual trickery was the lava bed's greatest defense. It hid its complexity until one was standing directly inside it. Greene could see no sign of the enemy, no movement along the ridges, no smoke from campfires. The landscape appeared deserted, a barren wasteland devoid of life. This silence was more unnerving than the noise of battle. It suggested that the enemy was watching, waiting, and perfectly concealed. On the eastern flank, Captain Bernard's cavalry troopers faced an even more grueling trek. They had to ride miles out of their way to flank the position, navigating a narrow corridor between the rising bluffs and the muddy shores of the lake. The horses struggled in the sand and the sharp rocks, their breathing becoming labored and heavy. Bernard kept a sharp lookout, knowing that his separated force was vulnerable to ambush. He sent scouts ahead, men who rode low in their saddles, their carbines resting across their thighs. They reported nothing but empty rock and wind. The sense of isolation grew with every mile that put distance between them and the main column. They were moving into the unknown, trusting that the plan would hold together when the shooting started. As the afternoon wore on, the weather began to turn. The crisp brightness of the morning faded as gray clouds drifted in from the north, obscuring the peaks of the distant mountains. The temperature dropped steadily, the moisture in the air freezing on the wool coats of the men. A light mist began to form, clinging to the low ground, blurring the edges of the rocks. It was the precursor to the dense fog that was common in the basin during the winter months, a meteorological shifting of the odds that the army planners had not fully accounted for. The visibility, which had been miles at the start of the march, began to shrink, drawing the horizon closer to the advancing troops. The artillery mules were suffering. The weight of the cannon barrels and carriages was immense, and the uneven footing made every step a torture for the animals. Handlers had to guide them individually, shouting and shoving to keep them moving over the jagged ridges. The promise of artillery support was becoming a logistical nightmare before a single shot had been fired. If the guns could not be brought into range, the infantry would have to rout, the Modocs out with rifles alone, a prospect that the foot soldiers viewed with increasing trepidation. They looked at the dark maw of the stronghold and wondered just how many rifles were pointed back at them from the shadows. By late afternoon, the western column reached its designated staging area, a ridge of high ground roughly 1.5 miles from the main Modoc position. Major Green ordered a halt, and the men collapsed onto the rocks, exhausted from the march. They chewed on hardtack and took sips from their canteens, their eyes never leaving the enemy terrain. The officers gathered to confer, checking their watches and confirming the timeline for the assault. The plan called for the artillery to open fire at dawn, softening up the defenses, followed by a general advance of the infantry skirmish line. It was a textbook maneuver, reliant on visibility and coordination. A single shot rang out from the rocks ahead, a sharp crack that echoed across the valley. A soldier near the front of the line ducked instinctively, dirt kicking up near his boot. It was a warning shot, a message from the Modocs that the army had crossed an invisible line. No target presented itself for return fire. The smoke from the enemy rifle dissipated instantly in the breeze. The soldiers gripped their weapons tighter, the reality of the situation settling in. They were not fighting a disorganized mob. They were facing a disciplined enemy that had established a kill zone. The playfulness of the volunteers evaporated, replaced by the somber realization that tomorrow would bring blood. As dusk approached, the communication between Green and Bernard became critical. Signal flags snapped in the wind, relaying messages across the distance confirming that the eastern force was in position. The encirclement was technically complete, but the gap between the units was still wide, a porous net that the Modocs might slip through. Wheaton, situated at the rear with the reserve, felt satisfied. The pieces were on the board. He sent orders down the line. No fires were to be lit that night. The element of surprise was gone, but he did not want to give the Modoc marksmen illuminated targets. The men would have to endure the freezing night without warmth. The sun dipped below the horizon, plunging the lava beds into deep shadow. The temperature plummeted well below freezing. The soldiers huddled together for warmth, wrapping themselves in blankets that felt paper-thin against the biting cold. The rocks they lay on sucked the heat from their bodies. Sleep was impossible for most. They lay awake, listening to the wind whistling through the fissures, a sound that mimicked human moaning. Every shifting shadow looked like a crawling warrior. Every snap of a twig sounded like a hammer cocking. The psychological strain of the waiting began to erode their endurance. In the distance, the Modoc camp remained dark and silent. There was no chanting, no drumming, no sign of the fear or panic the soldiers hoped to instill. The Modocs were at home in this hell. They knew where the water was. They knew which caves offered warmth. They were resting, waiting for the soldiers to come to them. The asymmetry of the situation was stark. The army was fighting the environment just as much as the enemy, while the Modocs used the environment as a weapon. The lava beds were not just a battlefield. They were an ally to the defenders. The mist that had started in the afternoon thickened as the night progressed. It rolled in heavy waves off the lake, settling into the depressions and valleys of the lava flow. It dampened the sound, creating a muffled, claustrophobic atmosphere. A sentry on the perimeter strained his eyes, realizing he could no longer see the man stationed 50 yards away. The world was shrinking down to the immediate radius of one's own breath. The grand tactical map in Wheaton's tent was becoming irrelevant. In the fog, there were no flanks, no maneuvers, only the gray wall in front of your face. Around midnight, a few probing shots were exchanged on the eastern line. The muzzle flashes illuminated the fog for brief seconds, revealing nothing but jagged rock. It was harassment fire, designed to keep the soldiers awake and on edge. It worked. The men lay flat, pressing their faces into the freezing stone, praying that the next bullet wouldn't find them in the dark. The officers moved among them, whispering reassurances, checking the lines, trying to maintain the structure of the unit in the dissolving visibility. The howitzers sat silent and cold, their bronze barrels frosted over. The crews slept near them, protective of the weapons that were their only advantage. They worried about the fuses on the shells, wondering if the damp air would affect the powder. The technical superiority of the army was fragile, dependent on conditions that were rapidly deteriorating. The belief in a quick victory began to wane, replaced by a gnawing dread that they had marched into a place that did not play by the rules of civilized warfare. Major Green sat wrapped in his greatcoat, staring into the gray void. He knew that at dawn he would have to order these men to stand up and walk into that fog. He reviewed the terrain in his mind, trying to memorize the landmarks he had seen earlier, but the image was fading. The lava beds were a maze, a chaotic jumble without logic or pattern. Once his men entered it, control would be lost. It would become a soldier's battle, fought at close range, man against man, rock against rock. As the hours of darkness stretched on, the cold seeped into the bones of the army. Fingers became numb, making it difficult to manipulate the intricate mechanisms of the breech-loading Springfield rifles. Water in the canteens turned to slush. The misery was absolute. The soldiers cursed the Modocs, cursed the officers, and cursed the god-forsaken rock they lay on. They wanted the sun to rise, not for the warmth, but to end the waiting. They wanted to shoot, to move, to do anything other than lie freezing in the dark while an invisible enemy watched. The 16th of January ended not with a bang, but with a shivering whimper. The mighty force that had marched out of Von Bremer's with flags flying and drums beating was now scattered across the jagged rim of the stronghold, cold, blind, and anxious. They had successfully marched into the trap. The jaws of the lava beds were open and the army was sitting right on the teeth. The fog continued to build, a white shroud preparing to wrap the coming violence in a layer of confusion and terror. The stage was set, the actors were in place, and the curtain of mist had fallen, hiding the slaughter that awaited the sunrise. January 17th, 1873. The bugle call for reveille sounded flat and muffled, swallowed instantly by the dense gray wall of fog that had settled over the lava beds during the night. Lieutenant Colonel Frank Wheaton emerged from his tent at the Van Bremer Ranch, his breath pluming in the freezing air, only to find that his view of the battlefield had been erased. The world ended 50 yards in front of his face. The tactical maps, drawn with precise lines indicating ridges, bluffs, and the Modoc positions, were rendered useless by the meteorological phenomenon. The Great Spirit, or perhaps just the cruel luck of the high desert winter, had granted the defenders a cloak of invisibility. Despite the blindness, Wheaton felt the pressure of the waiting nation and the expectations of his superiors. The order remained unchanged. The attack would proceed. The pincer movement, designed to crush the Modoc resistance between the hammer of the west and the anvil of the east, would move forward into the white void. The soldiers of the western column under Major John Green formed up in the pre-dawn gloom. Their uniforms were stiff with frost and their fingers were numb inside their gloves. They checked their Springfield rifles one last time, wiping moisture from the breech blocks, knowing that a single drop of water freezing in the mechanism could turn their weapon into a club. The command to advance was given not with a shout, but with a ripple of movement that passed down the line. They stepped off the ridge and descended into the Pedregal, the chaotic field of volcanic rock that lay between them and the stronghold. The terrain was a nightmare of razor-sharp basalt, twisted into frozen ripples, deep fissures, and jagged spires. In the clear light of day it was difficult to traverse. In the fog it was treacherous. Men stumbled and fell, their knees and shins scraped raw by the stone, cursing in whispers as they tried to maintain some semblance of a skirmish line. As they moved deeper into the lava field, the silence was unnerving. The fog dampened sound, creating a sensation of isolation, even though hundreds of men were marching within shouting distance. A trooper could see the man to his left and right, but beyond that there was only the shifting gray mist. They were walking blind into a kill zone, relying on the compass bearings of their officers and the vague, looming shape of the terrain to guide them. The artillery mules struggled behind the infantry, their hooves slipping on the ice-slicked rock. The crews manning the mountain howitzers were anxious, knowing they could not target what they could not see. They dragged the guns forward, the iron wheels grinding loudly against the stone, a noise that seemed deafening in the stillness. At 8 o'clock in the morning, the first shot rang out. It was a single sharp crack that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. A private in the front rank crumpled forward, his face hitting the black rock, a .50 caliber slug buried in his chest. Before the echo of the first shot had faded, the fog erupted with muzzle flashes. The Modoc warriors, hidden in the crevices and natural trenches of the stronghold, opened fire on the vague shapes moving through the mist. They did not need to see the soldiers' faces. They fired at the sounds of boots on stone and the dark silhouettes against the gray background. The soldiers dropped to the ground, seeking cover behind the very rocks that were torturing their feet. Panic rippled through the line as the volume of fire increased. The soldiers raised their rifles and fired back, aiming at the orange flashes they saw in the fog. They were shooting at ghosts. The Modocs were masters of this terrain. They would fire, shift position through a connecting tunnel or trench, and fire again from a different angle. To the soldiers it seemed as if the very rocks were shooting at them. Major Green shouted orders to advance, trying to push the line forward through sheer force of will. He stood upright, exposing himself to the enemy fire, a display of bravery meant to inspire his men. But the men were pinned down, the bullets smacking into the stones inches from their heads, sending sprays of rock splinters into their faces. The howitzers were brought forward, the crews working frantically to unlimber the guns. They aimed the barrels in the general direction of the enemy fire and pulled the lanyards. The cannons roared, the sound magnified by the fog, and the shells whistled out into the white nothingness. The explosions were muffled thuds in the distance. Without spotters, the artillerymen had no idea if they were hitting the enemy positions or simply blasting harmless rocks. Worse, the disorientation caused by the fog raised the terrifying possibility of shelling their own men on the other side of the encirclement. After firing only a few rounds, the order was given to cease fire. The army's greatest technological advantage had been nullified by the weather. On the eastern flank, Captain Reuben Bernard's cavalry troopers fighting dismounted faced a similar hell. They had advanced close to the lake shore trying to close the trap, but were met with a withering crossfire from the bluffs above. The Modocs held the high ground, firing down into the exposed troopers. The soldiers scrambled for cover among the sagebrush and rocks, but the angles were all wrong. No matter which side of a rock they hid behind, a bullet seemed to find them. Men cried out as heavy slugs shattered arms and legs. The wounded lay in the open, the freezing mud turning red around them, while their comrades could only watch, unable to move without drawing fire. The communication between the two columns, difficult in clear weather, became impossible in the fog. Signal flags were useless. Messengers sent to run between the units were either lost in the maze or pinned down by snipers. The coordinated attack disintegrated into a series of isolated, desperate gunfights. Small groups of soldiers found themselves cut off, fighting for their lives against an enemy they could not count or locate. They fired blindly, consuming ammunition at a rapid rate, their barrels growing hot to the touch. The smoke from their black powder rifles hung in the heavy air, mixing with the fog to create a stinging sulfuric smog that burned their eyes and throats. Inside the stronghold, the Modoc warriors moved with calm efficiency. They knew every inch of the ground. They communicated with bird calls and whistles, coordinating their fire to suppress the soldiers' advance. Scar-faced Charlie, acting as a field commander, moved along the line, directing fire where the soldiers were bunching up. The women and children were safely tucked away in the deep caves, protected by thick layers of rock. The warriors felt invulnerable. They watched the soldiers firing wildly into the air, wasting their bullets on shadows. To the Modocs, the soldiers, looked like clumsy cattle stumbling into a slaughter chute. They picked their targets carefully, conserving their ammunition, making every shot a kill or a crippling wound. Back on the Western Front, Major Green grew increasingly frustrated. The attack had stalled completely. He organized a charge, gathering a group of brave men to rush a ridge where the enemy fire seemed heaviest. They sprang up, yelling to bolster their courage, and sprinted across the broken ground. The response was immediate and devastating. A volley of fire cut into them, dropping men mid-stride. The survivors dove back into cover, the charge broken before it had covered 20 yards. Green himself was tireless, moving up and down the line, but he could not fight the terrain. The gaps between the rocks were too wide, the cover too sparse, and the enemy aim too true. As the day wore on, the temperature did not rise. The wounded men, unable to be evacuated, began to freeze. Their cries for water and help echoed eerily in the fog, tearing at the morale of the men still fighting. The medics and stretcher-bearers could not reach them. To move was to die. The soldiers lay flat, pressing their bodies into the frozen earth, listening to the whiz and snap of bullets passing overhead. They began to realize the hopelessness of their situation. They were not fighting a battle. They were targets in a shooting gallery. The bravado of the previous day, the jokes about ending the war before lunch, had evaporated, replaced by a cold, hard knot of fear in their stomachs. The psychological impact of fighting an invisible enemy was profound. In a conventional battle, a soldier sees his opponent. He sees the charge, the flank, the physical reality of the threat. Here, there was nothing. Just the white wall and the death coming out of it. Rumors began to spread down the line that the Modocs were ghosts, spirits that could not be killed. The soldiers saw no bodies, no blood trails, no sign that their thousands of rounds of return fire had hit anything but stone. This lack of feedback created a sense of impotence. They were expending energy and life against a void that simply swallowed them up. Near the center of the Modoc line, the medicine man, curly-headed doctor, had strung a red rope of tool reeds between two rocks. He had told the warriors that as long as they stayed behind this line, no white man's bullet could touch them. The young men believed him, and their belief gave them a reckless courage. They stood up to fire, exposing themselves briefly, taunting the soldiers. The fact that none of them were hit only reinforced the superstition. The spiritual element of the war was working in tandem with the tactical situation. The Modocs felt protected by the land and the spirits. The soldiers felt rejected by both. By mid-afternoon, the pincer movement had failed completely. The two columns were still separated by a gap of several hundred yards, a gap filled with Modoc sharpshooters. Green and Bernard realized that they could not link up. To persist was suicide. The ammunition was running low and the men were exhausted, frozen, and demoralized. The order to retreat was the only logical option, though it tasted bitter in the mouths of the officers. It was an admission of total defeat. The withdrawal had to be executed with extreme care to prevent it from turning into a rout. The retreat began slowly, unit by unit, peeling back while others provided covering fire. The movement was agonizing. The soldiers had to crawl backward over the sharp rocks, dragging their wounded comrades by their coat collars. The dead were harder to move. In some cases, they had to be left where they fell, a violation of the soldiers' code that added shame to the defeat. The Modocs, sensing the withdrawal, increased their rate of fire, harassing the retreating troops, nipping at their heels like wolves chasing a wounded herd. The artillery was hauled back, the mules slipping and sliding, the crews cursing as they wrestled the heavy guns over the ridges. The fog began to darken as evening approached, adding a new layer of gloom to the proceedings. The soldiers stumbled out of the lava beds, their uniforms torn, their faces blackened with powder smoke, their eyes wide with the 1,000-yard stare of men who had seen death close up. They reached the staging areas and collapsed, too tired to speak, too tired to eat. The march back to the main camps was a funeral procession. The wagons, now loaded with groaning men instead of supplies, creaked and jolted over the rough road. The statistics of the day began to circulate, grim numbers that quantified the disaster. The army had suffered 37 casualties, 9 dead and 28 wounded. It was a heavy toll for a skirmish in the middle of nowhere. But the most crushing statistic, the one that would haunt the commanders and the politicians, was the enemy casualty count. As far as anyone could tell, they had not killed a single Modoc warrior. Not one body was found. Not one blood trail was discovered. Back at the Van Bremer Ranch, Colonel Wheaton sat in his tent, listening to the reports coming in from his field commanders. The magnitude of the failure was total. He had outnumbered the enemy 4-1. He had artillery. He had trained soldiers, and he had been whipped by a band of 53 warriors who had essentially fired from holes in the ground. The fog was an excuse, certainly, but it did not explain the sheer incompetence of the tactical approach. They had underestimated the enemy, and they had underestimated the terrain. The lava beds were not just a place where the Modocs were hiding. The lava beds were a weapon that the Modocs wielded with expert precision. The soldiers huddled around their campfires that night, the mood somber and quiet. There was no boasting now. They spoke in hushed tones about the invisible Indians and the rock fortress. They looked at their torn boots and their bandaged limbs. They knew now that this would not be a short war. It would be a long, bloody grind. The myth of the superiority of the white soldier had been shattered on the rocks of the stronghold. They had marched into the fog as conquerors and had crawled out as survivors. Inside the stronghold, the scene was one of jubilation tempered by vigilance. The warriors celebrated their victory, recounting the shots they had made, the way the soldiers had run. Kintpoos, however, remained cautious. He knew that the army was like a wounded bear. It would be angry, and it would come back. He looked at the ammunition they had expended. They had enough for now, but not forever. He knew that while they had won the battle, the siege would continue. The white men would not leave. They would bring more guns, more men, and more hate. The night of January 17th settled over the basin, heavy and cold. The fog remained, a shroud covering the bodies of the soldiers, left out in the rocks. The silence returned to the lava beds, but it was a different silence now. It was the silence of a graveyard. The stronghold had proven itself to be impregnable to a direct assault. The army had thrown its best punch and had broken its hand against the stone jaw of the defense. The war had changed. It was no longer a matter of military maneuver. It was a matter of starvation and attrition. The soldiers had learned a hard lesson. In the lava beds, the only thing you could be sure of was the ground beneath your feet, and even that was trying to kill you. The ghosts of the stronghold were real, and they had teeth. The defeat of the army in the freezing fog sent shockwaves through the military establishment that rippled all the way from the high desert of California to the marble halls of Washington City. The humiliating retreat of January 17, 1873 was not merely a tactical failure. It was a resounding political disaster that demanded an immediate and drastic restructuring of the entire campaign. Colonel Frank Wheaton, the architect of the failed assault, found himself relieved of his command. His decades of service tarnished by the 53 warriors who had successfully held off a force 6 times their size. The War Department, embarrassed and vengeful, needed a steady hand to restore order. In his place came Colonel Alvin Gillum, the newly appointed commander of the expedition. Canby was a man of significant stature, a seasoned veteran of the Mexican War and the Civil War, known for his prudence, administrative organizational skill, and a lack of the reckless ego that often plagued frontier officers. He arrived at the lava beds in February, bringing with him not just fresh troops, but a completely different philosophy of warfare. He did not intend to rush headlong into the razor-sharp rocks again. Instead, he planned to construct a cage around the Modocs and slowly crush them with superior logistics, patience, diplomacy, and, if necessary, overwhelming calculated force. On April 1st, the army established its primary headquarters at the base of the bluffs on the west side of the lava beds, a location that would soon become known to history as Gillum's Camp, named after Colonel Alvin Gillum, who commanded the troops in the field. The arrival of the general transformed the desolate sagebrush flat into a bustling, noisy military city. Rows of white canvas tents stretched out in precise geometric lines, housing nearly 1,000 soldiers. Corrals were built for the hundreds of horses and mules, and heavy supply wagons arrived daily from the distant railheads, bringing tons of fodder, crates of ammunition, and barrels of rations. The soldiers dug latrines, built stone walls to protect the tents from the howling wind, and settled into the monotonous rhythm of a siege. The sharp terror of the January campaign was replaced by the grinding drudgery of garrison duty in a hostile environment. The mud was deep, a sticky clay-like substance that clung to boots and wagon wheels in heavy clumps, and the wind was relentless, driving grit and alkaline sand into food, eyes, and rifle mechanisms. Men spent their days cleaning their weapons, repairing their uniforms, and staring at the jagged skyline, wondering when the order to advance would come again. Canby understood that the Modoc position was strong, but their resources were finite. He ordered the patrols to tighten the perimeter, cutting off access to the lake where possible and making it dangerous for the Modocs to hunt or scavenge for firewood. He deployed fresh units, including the 4th Artillery serving as infantry and additional cavalry troops, ensuring that the ring of steel around the stronghold was unbroken. At the same time, he initiated a peace commission authorized by the Grant administration to seek a bloodless resolution. The government, stung by the financial cost of the war, which was costing thousands of dollars each day, and pressured by humanitarian groups in the East, wanted the Modocs to surrender and return to the reservation without further loss of life. The Peace Commission was a disparate group of men tasked with the impossible. Alfred Meacham, the former superintendent of Indian Affairs for Oregon, was the chairman. He was a man who deeply sympathized with the Modoc grievances but was bound by his strict duty to the government. Reverend Eliezer Thomas, a Methodist minister from California, brought a moralizing, religious optimism to the table, believing that Christian charity and reason could bridge the gap between the warring parties. L.S. Dyer, the Indian agent from the Klamath Reservation, rounded out the primary negotiators. They were joined by Frank Riddle and his Modoc wife, Toby, known to her people as Winema. Toby Riddle was the crucial link, the interpreter who would carry messages between the general's tent and the lava caves. She was a cousin to Kientpoos, a woman of immense courage who found herself walking the razor's edge between two colliding worlds, trusted fully by neither side but essential to both. Inside the stronghold, the initial euphoria of the January victory had faded into the grim, gray reality of confinement. The conditions in the caves were deteriorating rapidly. The population of over 150 people, along with their dogs and horses, was crammed into a relatively small area of natural trenches and caverns. The sanitation was poor, and the smell of wood smoke, unwashed bodies, and animal waste hung heavy in the stagnant air of the lava tubes. While they had captured rifles and ammunition from the soldiers during the retreat, their food supplies were dwindling. The cattle they had brought with them were being consumed one by one, slaughtered in the dark recesses of the rocks, and the fresh water from the ice caves was becoming harder to harvest as the spring thaw approached, and the ice receded deeper into the fissures. Kientpoos felt the walls closing in. He stood for hours at the lookout posts, watching the white city of tents grow larger every day, counting the soldiers. He saw the new cannons, the Cohorn mortars that could lob shells high over the ridges and drop them vertically into the trenches, denying them the safety of the open trenches. He knew that another assault would not be like the last. The army would not make the same mistake twice. Kientpoos was a pragmatist at heart. He wanted a home for his people on the Lost River, a small square of land where they could live in peace, away from the harassment of the Klamath. He did not want to die in the rocks. He began to send messages back to Canby through the Riddles, expressing a tentative willingness to talk. However, Kientpoos was not the absolute monarch of his people. The Modoc leadership structure was based on consensus and influence, and his influence was under constant attack. The faction led by Hooker Jim, comprising the men who had slaughtered the settlers at Tule Lake, was vehemently opposed to any surrender. Hooker Jim, curly-headed Doctor, Bogus Charlie, and Steamboat Frank knew exactly where they stood in the eyes of the white law. If the tribe surrendered, Kientpoos might be treated as a prisoner of war or even given leniency. But the Tule Lake killers would face the hangman's noose for murder. For them, the war was an all-or-nothing proposition. They needed the entire tribe to keep fighting to protect their own necks. They were desperate men who viewed peace as a death sentence. Throughout March, a tense game of cat and mouse played out in the lava beds. Meetings were arranged and then canceled at the last minute. Messages were exchanged that were filled with misunderstandings, translation errors, and veiled threats. The commissioners would ride out to a designated spot in the lava beds, sitting on rocks under a white flag of truce, waiting for Modoc representatives who sometimes never showed. On other occasions, warriors would appear, sullen and armed to the teeth, demanding impossible concessions. They wanted complete amnesty for all acts committed. They wanted the soldiers to leave immediately. They wanted the Lost River Agency established before they laid down a single gun. Canby held firm to his instructions. Surrender first, then the government would decide their fate. He offered them safety for their persons as prisoners of war, but he could not promise immunity from the civil law for the murders of the civilians. The weather mirrored the diplomatic stalemate. Sudden squalls of snow and freezing rain lashed the basin, making the meetings physically miserable. The commissioners huddled in their heavy coats, their boots soaking in the freezing mud, while the Modocs stood wrapped in blankets, their faces unreadable and hard. Meekum began to sense the danger radiating from the younger men. He saw the dark looks the warriors cast at the peace party, the way they fingered the triggers of their rifles. He warned Canby that the Modocs were stalling, using the talks to rest and gather intelligence on the army's positions. Canby, however, was a man of immense patience and formal discipline. He believed that logic would eventually prevail. He did not understand the desperation of men like Hooker Jim, who had nothing left to lose. As April arrived, the pressure inside the stronghold reached a boiling point. The horses were starving, gnawing on the bark of the sagebrush and each other's manes. The people were eating dried meat that was tough and flavorless. The constant presence of the army, the bugle calls drifting on the wind, the sight of the sentries patrolling the perimeter created a psychological pressure cooker that was fracturing the tribe. Kientpus argued daily for a negotiated peace. He told the council that they could not fight the entire United States forever. He pointed out that their children were crying from hunger and cold. He proposed that they accept the offer to move to a reservation in a warmer climate, perhaps away from the Klamath enemies if it meant saving their lives. Hooker Jim countered with venomous rhetoric. He accused Kientpus of cowardice. He claimed that the soldiers were weak, that the medicine of curly-headed doctor would protect them, and that if they killed the leaders of the army, the soldiers would run away just like they did in the fog. He argued that the white men were leader-dependent. Cut off the head, and the body dies. It was a seductive lie born of ignorance and fear, but it resonated with the young warriors who were terrified of the gallows. They began to view Kientpus not as their protector, but as the obstacle to their survival. The turning point came in early April during a council meeting deep within the main cave. The firelight cast long dancing shadows on the basalt walls as the men debated their course of action. The atmosphere was thick with smoke and hostility. Kientpus stood his ground, refusing to agree to a plan to murder the peace commissioners. He stated that it was a dishonorable act that would bring ruin upon them all. He spoke of his word, of the flag of truce, and of the future of the tribe. He argued that killing the general would only bring more soldiers, more guns, and more death. Hooker Jim, seeing his influence wavering, played his final, most brutal card. He and his followers turned to ridicule. They mocked Kientpus, calling him a woman, a baby, a lover of the white man. In a dramatic and calculated gesture of disrespect, one of the warriors, likely Hooker Jim himself, grabbed a woman's shawl and threw it roughly over Kientpus's shoulders. Another jammed a woven woman's hat onto his head. The insult was devastating. In the hyper-masculine warrior culture of the Modocs, to be called a woman was the ultimate degradation. It stripped him of his authority, his dignity, and his manhood in front of his entire people. The warriors laughed, a cruel, biting sound that echoed off the stone walls. "You are not a Modoc warrior," they sneered. "You are a fish-hearted woman." The cave fell silent. Kientpus stood there, the shawl draped over his frame, the hat askew on his head. He looked at the faces of his people. He saw contempt in the eyes of the hotheads and fear in the eyes of the moderates. He realized that he had lost control. If he persisted in his path of peace, he would be deposed, perhaps even killed by his own men, and the tribe would follow Hooker Jim into oblivion. To regain his command, to prove he was a Modoc warrior, he had to embrace the violence, they demanded. He pulled the shawl from his shoulders and threw it to the ground. He snatched the hat from his head and cast it into the fire. He looked at Hooker Jim with a cold, dead stare. He told them he would do it. He would kill the general. He would commit the act that would seal his own fate, effectively signing his own death warrant to prove his loyalty to the tribe. But he added a prophecy. He told them that this act would not save them. He told them that when he died, he would fall on the ruins of their nation. It was a tragic moment of resignation. The leader sacrificed his moral compass and his future to retain the loyalty of a doomed people. The plan was hatched quickly. The next meeting with the Peace Commission was scheduled for April 11th, Good Friday. It would take place at a council tent set up midway between the lines, a neutral ground in the lava rocks. Kintpoos would attend, along with Shanshan John, Boston Charlie, Black Jim, and others. They would carry concealed revolvers under their coats. The signal would be the phrase, "All ready." At that moment, they would draw their weapons and kill everyone at the table. They believed that by cutting off the head of the snake, killing General Canby, the body of the army would wither and retreat. Winema, moving between the camps, sensed the change in the atmosphere. She heard the whispers. She saw the way the warriors sharpened their knives. She tried to warn the commissioners. She told Meacham that the mood in the stronghold was dark, that she feared treachery. Meacham took her warnings seriously and relayed them to Canby. He urged the general to meet only with a strong-armed escort or to cancel the talks entirely. He pointed out the strange behavior of the Modocs, their reluctance to talk, their aggressive posturing. General Canby dismissed the fears. He believed that the Modocs were posturing for leverage. He relied on his experience with other tribes, believing that a show of trust was necessary to break through the suspicion. He argued that if they showed fear, the negotiations would collapse anyway. He wrote to Washington that he believed he could still bring the matter to a peaceful conclusion. He was a man trapped by his own decency and his adherence to the formal rules of engagement, unable to comprehend the nihilistic corner into which Hooker Jim had painted the Modoc leadership. He ordered that no weapons be carried by the commissioners to the meeting, to show good faith. On the night of April 10th, the stronghold was quiet. The decision had been made. The weapons were cleaned and loaded. Kintpoos sat by his fire, a man alone in a crowd. He knew that the sun rising tomorrow would illuminate the last day of the world as he knew it. He had been forced into a corner by the relentless advance of the white settlers, the incompetence of the reservation agents, the aggression of the army, and finally the treachery of his own kin. The coil had tightened until there was no room left to breathe, no room left to maneuver. There was only the explosion to come. At Gillam's camp, the commissioners prepared for the meeting. Reverend Thomas prayed for guidance, believing that God would protect them in their righteous mission of peace. Meacham checked his small derringer, slipping it into his pocket against his orders and his better judgment, a small concession to the dread gnawing at his gut. Canby reviewed his notes, preparing the offer he would present one last time. He would offer them a place to live, food and shelter, but they had to come out. He slept soundly, confident in his authority. The soldiers on the perimeter shivered in their greatcoats, watching the dark mass of the lava beds. They did not know about the shawl or the hat. They did not know about the assassination plot. They only knew that the waiting was agony and that something had to break. The tension in the air was physical, a static charge building before the lightning strike. The pieces were set for a collision that would shatter the Peace Commission and turn the Modoc War into a hunt for vengeance. The diplomatic phase was effectively over. The hours were ticking down toward murder. April 11th, 1873. The Friday morning sun struggled to pierce the high, thin clouds drifting over the lava beds, casting a flat, shadowless light across the basin. At Gillam's camp, the air was crisp and still, holding the deceptive tranquility that often precedes a violent storm. Brigadier General Edward Canby woke early, dressing with the meticulous care of a career officer who believed that appearance and discipline were the bulwarks against chaos. He donned his full-dress uniform, the gold buttons gleaming against the dark blue wool, and brushed his gray beard. To him, this day was another step in a necessary administrative process, a meeting to finalize terms or at least keep the dialogue open. He did not feel the predatory gaze fixed upon him from the rocks a mile away. He gathered his papers, lit a cigar, and stepped out into the cool air, greeting the other commissioners who were preparing for the journey to the council tent. Alfred Meacham was less sanguine. He moved with a nervous, jerky energy, his eyes scanning the horizon repeatedly. He had listened to the warnings of Toby Riddle, the interpreter Winema, and the dread had settled deep in his gut. He checked the small Derringer pistol he had secreted in his pocket, a violation of the agreement but a necessary comfort for a man who felt he was walking to his own funeral. Reverend Eliezer Thomas, clutching his Bible, seemed lost in prayer, his faith providing a shield against the fear that Meacham openly displayed. L.S. Dyer, the Indian agent, was practical and grim, checking the cinch on his horse, his senses alert. The group gathered near the edge of the camp, the soldiers watching them with a mixture of curiosity and unease. The men of the rank and file sensed the danger that their general seemed to ignore, muttering among themselves as the small party set out toward the neutral ground. The peace tent stood solitary in a clearing among the sagebrush, roughly midway between the army lines and the Modoc stronghold. It was a simple canvas structure flapping gently in the breeze, a white island in a sea of black rock. To reach it, the commissioners had to traverse a stretch of open ground that felt miles long to Meacham. They walked and rode past the pickets, leaving the safety of the organized military lines behind. Winema rode with them, her face a mask of tragedy. She knew her cousin Kientpoos, and she knew the men who followed him. She had begged the commissioners not to go, or to at least take soldiers, but Canby had been adamant. He walked with a steady, confident stride, the smoke from his cigar trailing behind him, a symbol of the civilization he represented in this wild place. As they approached the tent, they saw the Modoc party waiting. Kientpoos stood near the small fire that had been built outside the entrance, warming his hands. He wore a coat that seemed too large for him, the fabric bulging slightly around the waist. Beside him stood Shanchin John, the older sub-chief, his face lined and hard. Boston Charlie, Bogus Charlie, Black Jim, and Ellen's man loomed nearby, their postures relaxed but their eyes sharp and shifting. They did not look like men seeking peace, they looked like coiled springs. They greeted the commissioners with nods, but there were no handshakes, no warmth. The air around the fire was thick with tension, heavier than the wood smoke. Canby offered cigars to the Modocs, a ritual of diplomacy he had used dozens of times. Kientpoos accepted one, lighting it from the fire, but his eyes never left the general's face. They sat on stones and logs arranged around the fire, the canvas of the tent blocking the view of the distant army camp. The conversation began haltingly. Canby opened with his standard speech, speaking of the great father in Washington and the desire for peace. He spoke of a reservation in a warm climate, of houses and cattle, of a life free from the running and the fighting. His voice was calm, reasonable, the voice of a grandfather speaking to petulant children. Kientpoos listened, smoking the cigar, his expression unreadable. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and edged with iron. He said that he did not want to go to a strange land. He wanted a home on the Lost River. He wanted the soldiers to move away. He gestured to the landscape around them, claiming it as his own. He looked at Meacham and demanded to know why the soldiers were still building stone walls if they wanted peace. He pointed out the hypocrisy of talking peace while tightening the noose. The dialogue circled the same tired arguments, but there was a new aggression in the Modoc responses, a lack of the deference they had shown in previous meetings. Hooker Jim, who had been pacing near the horses, wandered over to the group. He grabbed Meacham's coat, laughing, and asked if he was a medicine man. He made jokes in Modoc that the commissioners could not understand, but the tone was mocking and cruel. Meacham pulled his coat away, his heart hammering against his ribs. He looked at Canby, silently pleading with him to end the meeting and withdraw. Canby ignored the provocation, remaining seated, his eyes fixed on Kintpoos. He told the Modoc leader that he did not have the authority to remove the soldiers until the Modocs surrendered. He said the orders came from Washington and could not be changed. Kintpoos stood up, brushing the ash from his pants. He looked toward the sagebrush to the east, where two Modoc warriors, Barncho and Slowlook, suddenly appeared carrying rifles. This was a direct violation of the truce terms. Canby turned to look at them, his brow furrowing. Kintpoos turned back to the general. He spoke a phrase in his native tongue. At we, which meant already. It was the signal. In a split second, the facade of diplomacy shattered. Kintpoos drew a revolver from beneath his coat, the metal flashing in the dull light. He pointed the barrel directly at General Canby's face, the distance between them less than 3 feet. The hammer snapped down. The cap misfired, a dull click that sounded like a dry twig snapping. Canby stared at the weapon, perhaps not fully comprehending the betrayal in that fraction of a second. Kintpoos did not hesitate. He recocked the weapon instantly and pulled the trigger again. This time the gun roared. The bullet struck Canby under the right eye, shattering the bone and tearing into his brain. The general's head snapped back and he collapsed backward off the log, his cigar tumbling into the dirt. He did not die instantly. He lay on the ground, blood pouring from the wound, his body convulsing in shock. At the same moment, Boston Charlie drew his weapon and fired at Reverend Thomas. The minister had risen to his knees, his hands raised, crying out, "Don't shoot!" The bullet struck him in the chest, knocking him onto his back. He lay there, gasping, clutching his Bible as the blood spread across his black coat. The violence was total and chaotic. Shanchin John drew his pistol and fired at Meacham. The bullet struck Meacham in the shoulder, spinning him around. Meacham, fueled by pure adrenaline, drew his derringer and fired back, backing away, trying to reach the horses. L.S. Dyer, the most alert of the group, had seen the movement before the first shot. He sprinted away the moment Kintpoos drew his gun. He ran toward the army lines, weaving through the sagebrush. Black Jim and Hooker Jim chased him, firing their rifles. Bullets kicked up dirt around Dyer's heels and zipped past his ears. He turned and fired his own pistol, keeping them at bay just enough to maintain his lead. His lungs burned, his boots pounded the hard earth, but he did not look back. He ran for his life, the sounds of the massacre fading behind him into a dull roar of blood in his ears. Back at the fire, the horror continued. Kintpoos stood over the fallen general. Canby was still moving, trying to rise. Ellen's man joined Kintpoos, and together they pinned the dying man down. Kintpoos drew a knife and stabbed Canby repeatedly in the neck and chest, venting the frustration of months of siege. They stripped the uniform coat from his body, taking it as a trophy of war. The symbol of the United States Army lay half naked in the dirt, his lifeblood soaking into the volcanic soil. Reverend Thomas died quietly, his prayers cut short by a second shot to the head delivered by Boston Charlie. The warriors laughed, mocking the man's faith as they rifled through his pockets. Meacham, wounded and stumbling, was chased down by Shanchin John. He was shot again and fell to the rocks. He lay conscious but unable to move, playing dead as the warriors stripped his clothes. One of them, eager for a prize, took out a knife and began to cut a circle around Meacham's scalp. The steel blade sliced through the skin of his forehead. Meacham felt the agony but held his breath, knowing a scream would bring a final bullet. Winema, who had been spared the initial volley, screamed at the warriors. She threw herself between them and Meacham, shouting that the soldiers were coming. It was a ruse, a desperate lie to save the man who had tried to help them. She pointed toward the ridge, yelling that she saw the cavalry. The warriors, flushed with the adrenaline of the kill and possessing the prizes they wanted, hesitated. They looked toward the army camp, fearing a massive retaliation. Kintpoos ordered a withdrawal. They gathered the weapons, the coats, and the horses of the commissioners and melted back into the lava beds, leaving the carnage behind them. At the signal station on the bluff overlooking the camp, the observers had seen the commotion through their field glasses. They saw the puffs of smoke and the figures running. The signal flags waved frantically, spelling out the disaster. "They are firing on the flag! The commissioners are down!" The news hit Gillam's camp like a physical blow. The soldiers who had been idling in the lines grabbed their rifles without waiting for orders. A roar of rage went up from the ranks. The general was dead. The peace was dead. Major Mason ordered the cavalry to mount up and ride to the scene. They galloped across the open ground, their sabers drawn, their faces twisted with fury. They arrived at the peace tent too late. The Modocs were gone. They found Canby's body pale and mutilated, stripped of its dignity. They found Reverend Thomas, his white shirt stained red. They found Meacham, barely alive, his scalp partially detached, groaning in the dirt. Winema was kneeling beside him, trying to staunch the bleeding. Dyer was found breathless but unharmed near the picket lines. The soldiers loaded the bodies onto stretchers, their movements rough with anger. They looked toward the stronghold, their eyes burning with a desire for vengeance that transcended military discipline. This was no longer a war of containment. It was a blood feud. They carried the dead general back to the camp, passing the lines of silent, shocked troops. The sight of Canby's body galvanized the army. The restraints of policy and politics were gone. The order came down from the highest levels almost immediately. No more talks, no more flags of truce. Total extermination or unconditional surrender. Inside the stronghold, the warriors returned as conquering heroes. They wore the clothes of the white chiefs. They brandished the captured pistols. Kintpoos wore the general's uniform coat, though it hung heavy on him. The tribe celebrated, dancing and singing, believing that they had struck a mortal blow to the enemy. Hooker Jim and his faction were triumphant, their logic seemingly vindicated. They had killed the head of the snake. They expected the soldiers to flee in terror. But Kintpoos, sitting apart from the celebration, felt the weight of the coat and the weight of his actions. He looked at the faces of his people and saw a false hope. He knew the white man's way of war better than they did. He knew that by killing Canby, he had not frightened the army away. He had unlocked a door that held back a flood. He had united the white nation against them. He had made it impossible for anyone, anywhere, to speak in their defense. He touched the fabric of the stolen uniform and felt the cold seep into his bones. He had proved his bravery to his men, but in doing so, he had doomed them all. That night, the camp of the soldiers was not silent. It buzzed with the angry energy of a hive that had been kicked. The artillery crews polished their shells. The infantry sharpened their bayonets. There was no more talk of going home or of the unfairness of the war. Every man in the camp, from the colonel to the lowest private, had a singular purpose now. The murder under the flag of truce had violated the most sacred laws of their world. The lava beds would no longer be a prison. They would be a killing floor. The attack was planned for the 15th. 3 days to prepare, 3 days to mourn. And then, the unleashed fury of a modern army would descend upon the rocks. April 12th dawned on a landscape that had fundamentally changed. The neutral ground was gone. The space between the lines was now a no-man's land where anything that moved would be shot. The peace tent stood empty, flapping in the wind, a ghostly monument to the failure of words. Bloodstains marked the dirt where the men had fallen, dark patches that the dry earth had drunk greedily. The wind whistled through the sagebrush, carrying the sound of hammers from the army camp as coffins were built. The Modoc War had entered its final, most brutal phase. The time for talking was over. The time for dying had begun in earnest. April 15th, 1873. The bugles at Gillam's camp did not sound a mournful dirge for the murdered general. They sounded the sharp, aggressive notes of the General Assembly. The United States Army was no longer a peacekeeping force or a constabulary seeking an arrest. It was a machine of retribution fueled by a collective rage that permeated every rank from the colonels to the mule packers. 3 days of seething anger had sharpened the resolve of the 600 soldiers preparing to advance. They had seen the mutilated body of Canby, and the sight had stripped away any lingering sympathy for the Modoc cause or any hesitation about the morality of the conflict. The orders from Washington were clear and brutal: unconditional surrender or total extermination. There would be no more parleys, no more white flags, and no more hesitation. Colonel Alvin Gillam, now in full command of the field operations, had devised a plan that relied on brute force and superior technology rather than tactical finesse. He knew he could not outmaneuver the Modocs in the rocks, but he could outgun them. He had reorganized the troops into 3 distinct columns. On the left, Major John Green commanded the infantry, tasked with pushing along the lake shore to sever the Modoc water supply. In the center, Captain Edwin Mason led the 21st Infantry to pressure the front of the stronghold. On the right, the cavalry under Captain Reuben Bernard would sweep around the eastern flank to close the trap. But the linchpin of the assault was not the riflemen, it was the artillery, specifically the battery of Coehorn mortars that had been brought up to the front lines. At 8 o'clock in the morning, the signal gun fired. The entire line of the army, stretching for over a mile, stepped off in unison. Unlike the disjointed, fog-blinded disaster of January, this advance was methodical and grinding. The sun was bright, the visibility clear. The soldiers moved from rock to rock, providing covering fire for one another, refusing to charge blindly into the kill zones. They suppressed the enemy fire with sheer volume, pouring thousands of rounds of .50-70 caliber ammunition into the lava beds. The heavy slugs chipped away the basalt defenses, forcing the Modoc warriors to keep their heads down. Then the mortars opened up. These short, squat bronze cannons were a terrifying evolution in the warfare of the lava beds. Unlike the mountain howitzers, which fired on a flat trajectory and smashed uselessly against the outer walls of the fortress, the Coehorn mortars lobbed their explosive shells in a high, steep arc. The rounds climbed high into the blue sky, hung there for a moment, and then dropped almost vertically down into the trenches, crevices, and natural caves where the Modoc families were hiding. There was no cover from a vertical attack. The Modocs looked up to see death falling from the heavens. The first shells impacted with earth-shattering concussions. They exploded within the confined spaces of the lava trenches, magnifying the blast and sending razor-sharp fragments of iron and rock flying in all directions. The psychological impact was immediate. For months, the Modocs had felt safe behind their walls of stone. Now the walls offered no protection. The deep recesses of the stronghold, once sanctuaries, became echo chambers of terror. Women clutched their children, pressing them into the deepest shadows as the ground shook rhythmically. The warriors, trying to return fire at the advancing soldiers, found themselves ducking every few minutes as another shell whistled down. Kientpus moved through the smoke and dust, checking his perimeter. He saw the difference in the soldiers immediately. They were not running away this time. They were moving forward with a grim, mechanical persistence. He watched as a mortar shell landed in a corral. Exploding among the few remaining horses, the animals screamed, a sound that cut through the roar of the rifles, adding to the cacophony of the siege. He realized that his assassination of Canby had not broken the army's will. It had hardened it into something diamond hard and unbreakable. By midday, the fighting on the left flank near the lake became critical. Major Green's men were pushing hard toward the water. The Modocs understood the stakes. The stronghold had no natural springs. Their only source of water was Tool Lake. If the soldiers controlled the shoreline, the fortress would become a dry tomb. Modoc marksmen, including the deadly Scarface Charlie, positioned themselves in the rocks overlooking the water, pouring a withering fire into the advancing infantry. Soldiers fell, clutching shattered limbs, but the line did not break. They crawled forward inch by inch, returning fire, supported by the relentless pounding of the mortars. The thirst began to set in early for the defenders. The dust from the explosions and the acrid smoke of the black powder dried out throats and stung eyes. The water storage in the caves was low. The families had been rationing for days, and now, with the intense physical exertion of the battle, the need for water became a physical pain. Children cried for a drink, their voices joining the chorus of the battle. The warriors fighting on the rim of the stronghold licked their dry lips, their tongues swelling in their mouths, knowing that the cool water of the lake was only a few hundred yards away, yet completely unreachable. As the afternoon wore on, the army slowly tightened the noose. The lines of communication between the Modoc firing pits began to fracture. The noise was deafening. The cohorn mortars fired with a monotonous regularity. Thump, a pause, crash, thump, crash. It was a rhythm of destruction that allowed no rest. The soldiers on the front lines reached the first line of Modoc breastworks, finding them abandoned. They climbed over the loose stone walls, wary of booby traps, and pressed deeper into the Pedregal. Nightfall on April 15th brought no relief. In a break from standard doctrine, Gillam ordered the mortars to continue firing throughout the night. He wanted to deny the Modocs any sleep. The sky was illuminated by the fuses of the flying shells, tracing fiery arcs against the stars before detonating in the darkness below. The explosions kept the defenders awake, their nerves fraying under the constant concussions. It was a form of psychological torture. Every time a warrior closed his eyes, the ground jumped beneath him. The morning of April 16th dawned on a landscape scarred by craters and debris. The army resumed its advance at sunrise. The primary objective for the day was the final seizure of the shoreline. Major Green rallied his men for a charge across a stretch of open ground near the lake. They sprinted forward, yelling to intimidate the enemy and to bolster their own courage. The Modocs fired back, but their volume of fire had noticeably decreased. They were running low on ammunition and they were exhausted. The soldiers reached the water's edge, securing the bank. A cheer went up from the army lines. They had severed the artery. The stronghold was now cut off from the world. Inside the caves, the situation became desperate. The lack of water was now a crisis. The mothers could no longer comfort their infants. The warriors were fighting with the sluggishness of severe dehydration. Kintpus called a council in the main cave, shouting to be heard over the mortar blasts. The air in the cave was thick with dust and the smell of fear. He looked at his sub-chiefs. Hooker Jim, the architect of the escalation, looked haggard, his face streaked with soot. The medicine of the red rope had failed. The shells fell regardless of their superstitions. Kintpus laid out the reality. They could not hold the stronghold. If they stayed, they would die of thirst or be blown to pieces by the bronze guns. They had to leave. They had to abandon the fortress that had protected them for 5 months. The plan was risky. They would have to slip through the army lines under the cover of darkness, moving the women, children, and the wounded through the jagged fissures to the south. It was a movement that required absolute silence and stealth in the face of an enemy that was listening for the snap of a twig. Throughout the afternoon of the 16th, the Modoc fire slackened further. The soldiers interpreted this as a sign that the enemy was weakening, perhaps preparing to surrender. They did not press the final assault, preferring to let the mortars do the work. They settled into their positions, watching the stronghold, waiting for the white flag that Canby had wanted so badly. But no flag appeared. The rocks remained silent and defiant, absorbing the punishment without complaint. As the sun set on the second day of the battle, the thirst in the caves was agonizing. Men drank the blood of the few remaining cattle to moisten their throats. They sucked on damp stones. The preparation for the evacuation began. The women packed what little they could carry. The old people, those too frail to make the trek over the razor-sharp rocks, prepared themselves for the end, or to be carried by their kin. The warriors stripped the dead of their weapons and ammunition. They would leave nothing of value for the soldiers. The night of April 16th was moonless and pitch black, a final mercy from the land. The mortar fire continued, but the intervals had lengthened as the artillery crews grew tired. Under the noise of the bombardment, the Modoc nation began to move. They filed out of the caves, entering the deep crevices that scarred the southern end of the lava beds. These fissures, some so deep the bottom was lost in shadow, provided a natural covered highway leading away from the lake. Kintpoos led the vanguard, his eyes straining in the darkness. They moved like ghosts, their moccasined feet finding purchase on the silent stone. The movement was slow and terrifying. A crying baby had to be muffled instantly. The clink of a rifle barrel against a rock could alert the sentries posted only 100 yards away. They moved past the bodies of the unburied dead, the smell of decay mixing with the sulfur of the shelling. They climbed over ridges and descended into bowls of obsidian glass. They were leaving their home, their sanctuary, and moving out into the open, hostile wilderness. The stronghold, the symbol of their resistance, was being left behind, an empty shell for the conquerors. Hooker Jim and a rear guard stayed behind for a few hours to keep up the pretense of a defense. They fired occasional shots at the army lines, moving from position to position to create the illusion of numbers. They shouted insults at the soldiers, their voices hoarse and cracking. Then, as the eastern sky began to gray with the approach of dawn on April 17th, they too slipped away, vanishing into the rugged terrain to the south, following the trail of their people. April 17th broke with a heavy silence. The mortars ceased firing. The army expected a final, desperate stand. The soldiers fixed their bayonets, the long triangular blades gleaming in the morning light. They formed up for the final assault, their faces set in grim lines. They expected to fight for every cave, every trench. The signal was given. The blue wave surged forward, sweeping over the final breastworks and pouring into the center of the stronghold. They found nothing. The caves were empty. The fires were cold ashes. The trenches were littered with debris, baskets, old blankets, bones, and shell casings. But the enemy was gone. The soldiers moved cautiously at first, fearing an ambush, checking the dark corners of the lava tubes with nervous aggression. But there was no one. The stronghold was a ghost town. The army had captured the rocks, but they had lost the Modocs. The frustration of the soldiers was palpable. They had pounded the earth for 3 days, expended tons of ammunition, and suffered casualties only to grasp a handful of air. They kicked through the refuse left behind, looking for souvenirs or signs of where the enemy had gone. They found pools of dried blood indicating wounded warriors had been carried off. They found the carcasses of the horses torn apart by shell fragments. In one of the caves, they found an effigy, a dummy made of stuffed clothes and sagebrush, propped up to look like a sentry. It was a final act of mockery from the retreating tribe. The soldiers tore it apart in frustration. The victory was hollow. They stood in the center of the fortress they had dreaded for so long and realized it was just a pile of rocks. The true strength of the Modoc defense had never been the stone. It had been the people, and the people were loose again. Colonel Gillum rode into the stronghold later that morning, surveying the scene with a mixture of relief and annoyance. He had reported a victory to Washington. He had taken the enemy position. But he knew the war was not over. The Modocs were now in the open country, desperate, thirsty, and vengeful. They had escaped the cage. The siege had ended, but the chase was about to begin. The soldiers explored the depth of the caves, marveling at the network of tunnels and the natural defenses. They saw the scorch marks from the mortar shells on the walls and realized how terrifying the bombardment must have been. They found the Skull Cave, the ice cave that had supplied the water, and saw that the ice had been chipped away to the very last dregs. They understood then the thirst that had driven the enemy out. As the sun climbed high on April 17th, the army secured the perimeter of the empty fortress. They raised the American flag over the highest point of the lava beds, the colors snapping in the wind. It was a symbolic gesture marking the reclamation of the land, but out in the distance to the south, the dust cloud of the retreating Modoc band was already settling. The death maze of the lava beds had been conquered, but the war had simply moved to a new, perhaps even more dangerous stage. The soldiers drank deeply from their canteens, savoring the water that the Modocs had been denied, and looked south toward the jagged horizon, knowing they would have to shoulder their packs and start walking again. The hunt was still on, April 26, 1873. The sun rose hot and bright over the lava beds, a stark contrast to the freezing fog that had plagued the army in January. 10 days had passed since the capture of the empty stronghold, and the mood at Gillam's camp had shifted from frustration to a dangerous form of complacency. The soldiers believed the Modocs were a broken people, scattered refugees fleeing south into the mountains, likely starving and terrified. This underestimation of the enemy was the prevailing sentiment as Captain Evan Thomas of the 4th Artillery prepared his patrol for a reconnaissance mission. Thomas was a brave officer, the son of the Adjutant General of the Army, but he was operating under the assumption that he was hunting fugitives, not entering the killing ground of a cohesive fighting force. The patrol consisted of roughly 70 men drawn from Batteries A and K of the 4th Artillery and Company E of the 12th Infantry. It was a mixed force, comprising seasoned officers and raw recruits who had barely learned to fire their rifles. Accompanying Thomas were several other officers of high standing. Lieutenant Thomas Wright, a Civil War veteran with a reputation for coolness under fire. Lieutenant Arthur Cranston, Lieutenant George Harris, and Acting Assistant Surgeon Robert Semig. They also brought along a pack train of mules carrying ammunition and rations, and even a few civilians and reporters who tagged along, treating the expedition as a sightseeing tour of the hostile territory. The atmosphere was almost festive as they marched out of the camp at 7 in the morning, leaving the safety of the perimeter behind. Their objective was to locate the Modocs in the vicinity of Sand Butte, a prominent volcanic cinder cone lying 4 miles to the south. The terrain between Gillam's camp and the butte was a tortured expanse of jagged lava flows, deep fissures, and patches of sand and sagebrush. As the column moved away from the main army position, the heat began to rise. The black rocks absorbed the solar radiation and radiated it back upward, creating a stifling oven that baked the men in their heavy wool uniforms. Sweat ran down their backs and the dust kicked up by 70 pairs of boots coated their throats. They marched without a skirmish line, moving in a loose column, talking and joking among themselves. They saw no sign of the enemy, no tracks, no smoke, no movement. The landscape appeared utterly devoid of life. By noon, the patrol reached the base of Sand Butte. The terrain here formed a natural geological trap, though to the untrained eyes of the officers it looked like a sheltered resting place. The trail passed through a depression, a flat sandy basin surrounded on 3 sides by high ridges of broken lava rock and sagebrush. The ridges dominated the low ground, offering perfect cover and commanding lines of sight. It was a textbook ambush site, the kind of terrain that military doctrine dictated should be scouted and secured before the main body entered. However confident that the Modocs were miles away, Captain Thomas halted the column in the center of the depression and ordered a rest break for lunch. The discipline of the unit evaporated instantly. The soldiers stacked their rifles in careless piles or leaned them against the rocks. They took off their heavy knapsacks and sat down in the sand. Many removed their boots to tend to blisters, massaging their sore feet. Bottles of wine were produced by some of the officers and civilians, and hardtack and beef were distributed. The men sprawled out, relaxing in the shadow of the ridges, completely exposed to anyone watching from the heights. Lieutenant Wright, sensing something wrong or perhaps just adhering to better discipline, kept a few of his men from the 12th Infantry on alert, but the majority of the patrol was effectively disarmed and disabled by their own comfort. High above them, concealed in the twisted crags of the lava ridges, Scar-faced Charlie looked down at the soldiers. He had roughly 22 warriors with him, including Hooker Jim and Boston Charlie. They had watched the column approach for hours, tracking their progress through the dust cloud. They had watched the soldiers march into the bowl and sit down. It was a target so perfect it seemed like a gift. The warriors positioned themselves in a horseshoe formation around the depression, settling their rifles into the crevices of the rocks. They were outnumbered 3-1, but they held the high ground, and they had the element of total surprise. Scar-faced Charlie waited until the soldiers were most vulnerable, their mouths full of food, their boots off, their weapons out of reach. The silence of the high noon was shattered by a single shot, followed instantly by a crashing volley that roared from the ridges like a thunderclap. The effect in the depression was catastrophic. Bullets ripped through the resting men before they could comprehend they were under attack. Soldiers were hit while holding canteens, while chewing bread, while lacing their boots. The sand erupted in geysers of dirt as rounds slammed into the ground. The acoustics of the lava basin magnified the sound of the rifles, making it seem as though they were surrounded by hundreds of gunmen. Panic, immediate and absolute, seized the enlisted men. The raw recruits, boys who had never heard a shot fired in anger, froze or scrambled wildly for cover. They dove behind small rocks that offered no protection from the plunging fire coming from above. Others ran in circles, screaming, their minds shattered by the sudden transition from peace to slaughter. They abandoned their rifles, leaving the stacks of weapons standing in the open as they clawed at the earth. The officers, to their credit, reacted with immense bravery. Captain Thomas sprang to his feet, shouting orders, trying to rally the disintegrating command. He drew his revolver and stood in the open, a clear mark for the snipers, yelling at his men to form a skirmish line. Lieutenant Wright gathered a small group of the 12th Infantry and tried to charge up the ridge to the west, attempting to dislodge the enemy and relieve the pressure. Lieutenant Cranston took 5 men and ran toward a rocky outcrop to the north, trying to secure a flank. The Modoc fire was precise and merciless. They ignored the panicked privates running away and focused their sights on the men shouting orders. They picked off the officers one by one. Lieutenant Cranston and his 5 men were cut down before they reached the rocks. Their bodies would not be found until days later, hidden in the brush. Lieutenant Wright's charge withered under a hail of 50 caliber slugs. He was hit in the groin and chest, collapsing onto the sharp stones. His men, seeing their leader fall, broke and ran, scrambling back down into the bowl or fleeing into the open desert. Captain Thomas realized that the situation was hopeless. The trap was shut. He shouted to his men to die like soldiers. He stood his ground, firing his pistol at the puffs of smoke on the ridges, refusing to retreat. A bullet struck him, knocking him to the ground. He struggled to sit up, still shouting encouragement to the few men who had stayed by his side. Another round struck him, ending his command. Around him, the other officers and non-commissioned officers were being systematically annihilated. Lieutenant Harris was shot through the lungs, the impact throwing him backward. Surgeon Semig was hit in the leg, the bone shattering, leaving him unable to move. The cohesion of the patrol was gone. It was no longer a military unit. It was a mob of terrified individuals trying to escape a slaughter pen. The majority of the enlisted men fled. They did not retreat. They ran. They threw away their rifles, their packs, their coats, anything that slowed them down. They ran north back toward Gillam's camp 4 miles away. They scrambled over the razor-sharp lava, tearing their uniforms and their skin, driven by the primal fear of the invisible death behind them. They left their officers, their wounded, and their honor in the dust of the depression. Scarface Charlie and his warriors watched the rout. They kept firing, but they did not pursue the fleeing soldiers. Their objective was to cripple the army's leadership and morale, not to chase down every single private. They remained in their secure positions on the ridges, firing down at the few pockets of resistance that remained in the bowl. The survivors in the depression were pinned down behind the bodies of their comrades and the carcasses of the mules. The air was thick with smoke and the screams of the dying. The heat of the day intensified, baking the wounded men who cried out for water. One of the most harrowing aspects of the slaughter was the proximity. The Modocs were close enough to shout insults at the soldiers. They called them by name, mocking the officers they recognized. They taunted the men cowering behind the rocks, asking them why they did not come up and fight. The psychological warfare was as damaging as the physical violence. It reinforced the idea that the Modocs were in total control, that they were the masters of this domain, and that the soldiers were merely intruders waiting to die. Back at Gillam's camp, the sound of the battle drifted over the lava beds. At first, the officers in the camp thought the patrol was target practicing, but the firing was too ragged, too continuous. Then the first stragglers began to arrive. They were a pathetic sight, exhausted, dehydrated, their eyes wide with terror. They gasped out incoherent stories of an ambush, claiming that Thomas was surrounded by 1,000 Indians. They claimed everyone was dead. They claimed the Modocs were demons. Colonel Gillam, realizing a disaster was unfolding, ordered Major Green to take the remaining troops and ride to the rescue. It took time to organize the relief column. The soldiers were fearful, infected by the panic of the survivors. They moved out cautiously, dreading what they would find. The 4-mile march to Sand Butte took hours as they checked every ridge, fearing another trap. By the time Major Green's relief force reached the depression, it was late afternoon. The shooting had stopped. The Modocs, seeing the large dust cloud of the approaching reinforcements, had slipped away as effortlessly as they had arrived. They took the weapons and ammunition of the dead, vanishing back into the labyrinth of the lava flows. The scene that greeted Major Green was a tableau of horror. The sandy basin was littered with bodies. The flies were already swarming in the heat. Captain Thomas lay dead, surrounded by the few brave sergeants who had refused to run. Lieutenant Wright was found alive but mortally wounded, his life ebbing away into the sand. Lieutenant Harris was gasping for air, clutching his chest. Surgeon Semig lay in agony. Everywhere there were dead soldiers, some still clutching the half-eaten rations they had been holding when the first volley was fired. The rescuers moved among the carnage, sickened by what they saw. It was not just the death, it was the nature of it. The patrol had been destroyed not in a battle, but in an execution. The ratio of officer casualties was staggering. Of the 5 commissioned officers who went out, 3 were dead or dying and 2 were severely wounded. The leadership of the patrol had been wiped out. The casualties totaled nearly 25 men killed and roughly 16 wounded, more than half the force. The evacuation of the wounded was a nightmare. The terrain that had been difficult to march over was torture for men with shattered bones and bullet wounds. There were not enough stretchers. The soldiers had to carry their comrades in blankets or on their backs, stumbling over the lava rock in the gathering darkness. Every jolt, every slip brought screams of pain from the injured. The procession back to Gillam's camp was slow and somber, a funeral march under the stars. The impact of the slaughter at Sand Butte on the army was devastating. The morale at Gillam's camp collapsed completely. The soldiers were terrified. They refused to leave the perimeter. They openly questioned their commanders. They looked at the lava beds and saw only death. The confidence that had existed that morning was replaced by a deep, paralysis-inducing fear. They felt that the Modocs could not be beaten, that the terrain was cursed. For the Modocs, the victory was absolute. Scarface Charlie had orchestrated a masterpiece of guerrilla warfare. With only 22 men and 0 casualties, he had destroyed a force 3 times his size, killed the enemy leadership, and captured rifles and ammunition. It was a tactical humiliation for the United States Army that had few equals in the history of the Indian Wars. The Modocs had proven that they did not need a fortress to fight. The entire landscape was their weapon. However, despite the victory, the strategic situation remained grim for the Modocs. They had gained weapons, but they had not gained water or food. They were still running. The victory at Sand Butte bought them time, but it also ensured that the army would not stop. The embarrassment of the defeat guaranteed that Washington would send more men, more guns, and more generals until the stain of April 26th was wiped out. As night fell over the lava beds, the silence returned to Sand Butte. The bodies that could not be carried out lay under the moonlight, watched over by the coyotes. The sand in the depression was stained dark. The wind whistled through the ridges where the warriors had lain in wait. The slaughter was over, but the war had entered a new phase of desperation. The army was broken, angry, and fearful, a dangerous combination. The Modocs were triumphant but hunted. The lava beds had claimed another harvest of souls, and the end was still nowhere in sight. May 10th, 1873. The complexion of the war shifted dramatically with the arrival of Brigadier General Jefferson C. Davis at the lava beds on May 2nd. Davis was a man cut from a different cloth than the cautious Canby or the overwhelmed Wheaton. He was a hard-bitten, volatile officer with a reputation for extreme aggression, known famously for having shot and killed a fellow Union general during the Civil War in a dispute. He did not come to the high desert to negotiate, nor did he come to contain. He arrived with a mandate to restore the tarnished honor of the United States Army and to hunt the Modoc people until they were either dead or in irons. His first act was to relieve Colonel Gillam of command, effectively ending the period of tentative, fearful probing that had characterized the campaign since the slaughter at Sand Butte. Davis reorganized the demoralized troops, instilled a fear in them that was greater than their fear of the enemy, and ordered the cavalry to ride the legs off their horses if necessary. The time for sieges was over. The time for a relentless, grinding pursuit had begun. The Modoc band, now numbering fewer than 50 fighting men and burdened with over 100 women, children, and elders, was moving constantly to avoid the tightening net. They had fled the stronghold and the Sand Butte victory, but their strategic situation had deteriorated. They were running out of water. The lava beds in May were a waterless hellscape, the few vernal pools drying up under the intensifying sun. Kintpoos knew that to survive they had to control the scattered waterholes. The band moved toward Dry Lake, also known as Saras Lake, a flat alkali basin located miles to the east of the original stronghold. It was a desolate place, an expanse of cracked white earth surrounded by low ridges and pine timber, but it held water. And water was now more valuable than ammunition. The army, however, had acquired a new weapon that neutralized the Modoc advantage of invisibility: the Warm Springs Scouts. A detachment of nearly 70 Tenino warriors from the Warm Springs Reservation in Oregon had joined the campaign, led by the frontiersman Donald McKay. These scouts wore army jackets over their traditional clothing, their long hair flowing loose, their eyes reading the ground with a skill the white soldiers could never hope to emulate. They hated the Modocs, their traditional enemies, and they fought with a ferocity that matched the defenders. They moved in front of the army columns, acting as the eyes and ears of the pursuit, stripping away the Modoc ability to ambush with impunity. On the afternoon of May 9th, a cavalry detachment under the command of Captain Henry Hasbrook arrived at Dry Lake. His force consisted of Battery B of the 4th Artillery, fighting as cavalry, and a troop of the 4th Cavalry, along with the Warm Springs Scouts. The men were exhausted, their uniforms coated in a thick layer of white alkali dust that irritated their skin and eyes. They had been riding hard, chasing rumors and tracks, and the horses were gaunt and rib-sprung. Hasbrook ordered the men to make camp in the bowl of the dry lake bed, utilizing the lower ground near the water. It was a tactical risk, camping in a depression, a haunting echo of the mistake Captain Thomas had made at Sand Butte. But the horses needed water desperately, and the scouts assured him the area was secure for the moment. High in the lava ridges overlooking the lake bed, the Modocs were watching. They had shadowed the column, waiting for a moment of weakness. To the warriors like Hooker Jim and Ellen's man, the scene below looked like another opportunity for a massacre. They saw the soldiers dismount, unsaddle their horses, and begin to set up their bivouac. They saw the cook fires being lit. The arrogance that had been born of their previous victories blinded them to the subtle differences in this new force. They did not see the heightened state of alert among the sentries, nor did they fully appreciate the presence of the Warm Springs Scouts who were camped slightly apart from the regulars. The Modocs moved into position during the night, creeping silently among the rocks, building small breastworks of stone on the rim of the basin, preparing to unleash a dawn volley that they believed would break the soldiers once again. The sun rose on May 10th, painting the eastern sky in streaks of violet and orange. The air was crisp, the silence of the desert absolute. In the army camp, the bugler prepared to sound reveille, and the men were stirring from their blankets, reaching for their coffee cups. Suddenly, the ridges to the north and east erupted with the familiar, terrifying crack of Modoc rifles. Bullets zipped through the camp, kicking up spurts of sand near the cooking fires and smashing into the sides of the supply wagons. Several horses screamed as they were hit, rearing and tearing at their picket ropes. In any previous engagement, this would have been the moment the soldiers panicked, at Lost River, at the Stronghold, and at Sand Butte. The initial surprise had caused a collapse in discipline, but these men were different. They were tired of running. They were tired of the humiliation. Instead of diving for cover and staying there, the troopers of the 4th Cavalry grabbed their carbines and sprinted toward the perimeter. Captain Hasbrook, a man of steady nerve, did not shout for a retreat. He shouted for a charge. The officers ran among the men, kicking them awake, directing their fire toward the puffs of smoke on the ridge lines. The Warm Springs Scouts reacted instantly. They did not fight like the drilled regulars. They stripped off their blue army coats, fighting in their shirt sleeves or bare-chested to identify themselves to each other and to move freely. They sprinted up the flanks of the ridges, moving from rock to rock with the agility of mountain goats. They began to sing their war songs, a high-pitched rhythmic chanting that chilled the blood of the Modocs. For the first time, the Modocs were hearing the sounds of their own kind coming at them, not the shouted commands of white officers. The scouts flanked the Modoc positions, pouring accurate fire into the rock piles that the defenders had thought were secure. Kintpoos, firing from a cluster of boulders, realized with a sinking heart that the dynamic had changed. He saw the soldiers below forming a skirmish line and advancing up the hill. They were not pinned down. They were attacking. The volume of fire coming from the Spencer repeating carbines of the cavalry was overwhelming. Thousands of rounds hammered the ridge, chipping away the basalt protection. The Modocs, low on ammunition, could not match the rate of fire. They had to pick their targets, but every time a warrior rose to fire, a dozen bullets answered him. The death of Ellen's man was the turning point. A brave and influential warrior, he had been one of the pillars of the resistance. He stood up to rally his men, shouting defiance at the Warm Springs scouts, and was struck squarely in the chest by a rifle ball. He fell back into the dust, his death visible to many of the defenders. A ripple of fear passed through the Modoc line. They had come to believe they were invincible, protected by the spirits and the land. Seeing one of their strongest leaders cut down in the open shattered that illusion. The psychological armor that had sustained them for 6 months cracked. Hasbrouck saw the wavering fire and ordered the final assault. "Charge!" the command echoed across the basin. The soldiers of the 4th Cavalry and the artillerymen rose from the sagebrush and surged forward, yelling at the top of their lungs. It was a release of months of pent-up aggression. They scrambled up the steep slopes, boots sliding on the loose shale, bayonets and carbines leveled. They wanted blood. They wanted to close. They, with the enemy who had tormented them from the shadows. The Modocs broke. It was not a tactical withdrawal this time. It was a rout. The warriors threw down their heavy packs and ran. They abandoned their positions, fleeing over the crest of the ridge and disappearing into the rough timber country beyond. They left behind everything that was essential for their survival. The soldiers crested the ridge, panting and sweating, firing at the retreating figures, but the Modocs were fast. The pursuit continued for a few miles, but the terrain was too broken for the horses to be effective. When the smoke cleared, the magnitude of the Modoc defeat became clear. The army had captured the Modoc pony herd, 24 horses and mules that were the tribe's only means of transporting their wounded and their supplies. More devastating was the capture of the camp itself. The soldiers found piles of ammunition, rifles, dried meat, and blankets. They found the water bottles. They effectively stripped the Modoc nation naked in the middle of a hostile wilderness. The death toll was not high in terms of numbers. Only a few warriors, including Ellen's man, lay dead on the rocks. But the material and morale loss was total. The soldiers stood amidst the captured spoils, chests heaving, adrenaline slowly fading into exhaustion. They looked at the bodies of their enemies and realized they were just men. The myth of the ghost warriors was dead. They had met the Modocs in open battle and had driven them from the field. General Davis's aggressive doctrine had been vindicated. The shame of Sand Butte had been washed away by the victory at Dry Lake. The troops looted the Modoc camp, destroying what they could not carry, ensuring that the enemy would have no base to return to. That night, miles away in the deep lava flows, the Modoc tribe began to disintegrate. The loss of the horses meant that the women, children, and the wounded had to walk. They were carrying heavy burdens, thirsty and terrified. The children were crying, their feet cut and bleeding on the sharp stones. The cohesion that had held the disparate bands together under the pressure of the siege evaporated in the face of the disaster. A vicious argument erupted around the small, smokeless fires of the retreat. Hooker Jim, the man who had forced the war upon the tribe by murdering the settlers, the man who had goaded Kientpoos into killing Canby, now turned on his leader. He blamed Kientpoos for the defeat. He blamed him for the lack of water, for the death of Ellen's man, for the misery of the women. It was a breathtaking display of hypocrisy, but desperation makes men irrational. Hooker Jim proposed that the tribe separate. He and his Tool Lake band would go their own way, believing they could move faster and evade the army better without the burden of Kientpoos's leadership. Kientpoos looked at the man who had ruined his life and the lives of his people. He saw the betrayal coming. He had sacrificed his honor to save them, had killed the general to prove his loyalty, and now, when the darkness was total, they were abandoning him. He told Hooker Jim to go. He said he was done with them. The tribe split. It was the death knell of the resistance. A house divided against itself cannot stand, and a tribe fractured in the presence of the enemy is doomed. Hooker Jim, Bogus Charlie, Scarface Charlie, and Shack Nasty Jim took their followers and moved west. Kientpoos, with his family and a dwindling group of loyalists, moved east toward the Big Sand Butte. They were now two small hunted groups rather than a single fighting force. They had no horses, little ammunition, and no food. They were gnawing on roots and killing the few dogs that remained for meat. The Army scouts picked up the divergent trails the next day. Donald McKay and his Warm Springs trackers saw the split immediately. They reported to General Davis that the Modocs had separated. Davis, sensing the kill, divided his forces as well. He sent columns to pursue both groups, keeping the pressure relentless. He knew that without horses, the Modocs could not outrun the cavalry. It was no longer a war, it was a roundup. For the soldiers, the victory at Dry Lake transformed their experience of the landscape. The lava beds, once a place of terror where every rock seemed to hide a sniper, became merely a difficult terrain to be traversed. They rode with confidence, their carbines resting easily across their saddles. They knew the enemy was running scared. They found evidence of the flight everywhere. Discarded baskets, a child's doll dropped in the sagebrush, bloodstains on the rocks where wounded men had rested. Kientpoos moved his people only at night, hiding in caves during the day. He was a man walking toward his own execution. He knew there was no escape. The Oregon border was closed. The California valleys were filled with soldiers. He thought of the lost river, of the life he had wanted, and realized it had all been a dream. Burned to ash by the fires of Hooker Jim's rage, he was the chief of a dying people, leading them on a death march through the desert. The days following May 10th were a blur of heat and exhaustion. The Army closed the distance. On May 22nd, the inevitable happened. Hooker Jim's band, starving and broken, surrendered to General Davis near Fairchild's ranch. They did not fight to the death as they had vowed. They walked out of the rocks with their hands up, begging for water and food. And then, in a final act of treachery that would stain his name forever, Hooker Jim offered to help the Army hunt down Kientpoos. He told General Davis that he knew where the chief was hiding. He offered to lead the soldiers to him in exchange for amnesty. Davis, a pragmatist who wanted the war over, accepted the deal. The man who had started the war, the man who had murdered the settlers, was now an Army scout tracking the leader who had tried to avoid the conflict. It was the ultimate irony of the Modoc War. The victory at Dry Lake had broken the back of the resistance, but the betrayal that followed broke its heart. The last stand had not been a glorious defense of the stronghold, but a dusty, desperate skirmish in an alkali basin that ended with a sprint for the hills. The warriors who had held off 1,000 men were defeated by thirst, by the relentless pressure of a new general, and by the frailty of their own unity. The chase was entering its final hour, and the hunters were now led by the very wolves who had once guarded the flock. June 1st, 1873. The manhunt that had consumed the resources of the United States Army and terrorized the settlements of the Oregon-California border finally ground to a halt in the willow-choked canyons of the Langell Valley. For weeks, the pursuit had been a relentless exercise in attrition, led not just by the cavalry but by the very Modoc warriors who had once fought beside the man they were now tracking. Hooker Jim, Bogus Charlie, Shack Nasty Jim, and Steamboat Frank, now wearing the armbands of Army scouts, had used their intimate knowledge of Kientpoos's habits to run him to ground. They had turned into bloodhounds, driven by the promise of amnesty for their own crimes if they delivered the head of their former chief. The betrayal was absolute, a final fracture in the tribal bond that stripped Kientpoos of his last defense, the loyalty of his kin. Kientpoos, the man the newspapers called Captain Jack, was cornered near Willow Creek. He was no longer the defiant war leader who had held the stronghold against artillery and infantry. He was a ragged, starving fugitive, his clothes torn to shreds by the brush, his feet wrapped in gunny sack scraps because his moccasins had disintegrated. His small band of loyalists, his family, Shanchin John, Black Jim, and a few others, were in even worse condition. They had been living on roots and the carcasses of horses for days, moving constantly to evade the patrols that crisscrossed the high desert. When the soldiers of the 1st Cavalry, led by Captain David Perry, finally closed the ring, there was no dramatic last stand. There was no final volley of rifle fire or charging of the line. Kintpoos simply emerged from the brush, his hands empty, his face gaunt and hollow-eyed. He told the officers that his legs had given out. The war ended not with a bang, but with the physical collapse of a man who had carried the weight of a doomed nation for 6 months. The soldiers took him into custody, treating him with a mix of curiosity and roughness. They had hunted this ghost for half a year, lost friends to his sharpshooters, and endured the freezing fogs and burning heats of the lava beds because of him. Now, seeing him in irons, some felt a strange anticlimax. He looked small, ordinary, stripped of the mythic stature the press had built around him. They marched him and the other male prisoners to Fort Klamath, a trek that served as a parade of the vanquished. The women and children followed in wagons, a weeping procession of the displaced. The Modoc War was officially over, but the machinery of military justice was just beginning to turn. Fort Klamath sat in a green valley north of the lake, a stark contrast to the black rock of the lava beds. It was a substantial post built of pine logs and sawn lumber, representing the permanent authority of the federal government. The arrival of the prisoners drew crowds of Klamath Indians and settlers, all eager to see the demons in chains. The Modoc men were shackled and placed in the guardhouse, a sturdy wooden structure that smelled of damp earth and unwashed bodies. They were chained to the floor, their movement restricted to the length of the iron links. The cell became a pressure cooker of resentment. Kintpoos found himself imprisoned not only with his loyal followers, but near the men who had hunted him down. Hooker Jim and the other turncoats roamed the fort with relative freedom, fed army rations and treated as allies, a constant galling reminder of the deal they had struck with General Davis. July arrived, bringing with it the dry heat of the high summer and the convening of the military commission. The trial was not a civil proceeding. It was a military tribunal organized to punish the killers of General Canby and the peace commissioners. The outcome was never in genuine doubt. The Army acted as judge, jury, and executioner. Lieutenant Colonel Washington Elliott presided over the commission, flanked by other officers who had fought in the campaign. The prisoners, Kintpoos, Shanchin John, Black Jim, Boston Charlie, Barncho, and Slowlix, sat on a wooden bench, their irons clanking whenever they shifted position. They had no legal counsel. No lawyer from the settlements dared to defend them, and the Army did not appoint one. They were expected to navigate the complex alien legal procedures of a capital murder trial with only their limited English and the translation of Frank and Toby Riddle. The proceedings were grim and efficient. The courtroom was packed with spectators, the air thick with the smell of tobacco smoke and sweat. Witness after witness took the stand to describe the events at the peace tent on April 11th. The most damaging testimony came from the Modocs themselves. Hooker Jim, Steamboat Frank, and the other Modoc bloodhounds took the stand, sworn in on a Bible they likely did not understand, and pointed the finger directly at their former leaders. They described the planning of the assassination, the insults heaped upon Kintpoos to goad him into the act, and the details of the murder itself. They minimized their own roles, painting themselves as reluctant participants forced along by Kintpoos's rage. It was a spectacle of survival. They were buying their lives with their testimony, and Kintpoos sat silently, listening to the lies and the half-truths that sealed his fate. When Kintpoos was finally allowed to speak in his own defense, he stood up, the chains rattling. He looked at the commission officers, men in blue uniforms just like the ones he had killed. He spoke with a quiet dignity, his words translated by the riddles. He did not deny killing Canby. Instead, he tried to explain the context. He spoke of the betrayal by the reservation agents, the hunger of his people, and the relentless pressure from the army. But most forcefully, he turned his gaze to Hooker Jim and the scouts sitting in the witness area. He told the commission that these men, who were now free, were the ones who had murdered the settlers at Tool Lake. He reminded the court that Hooker Jim had placed the woman's hat on his head and called him a coward to force him to kill the general. He asked why the law had two faces, one that hanged him and one that fed the men who were just as guilty. The logic of his defense was sound, but it fell on deaf ears. The commission was not interested in the internal politics of the tribe or the hypocrisy of the amnesty deal. They were interested in who pulled the trigger on General Canby. The verdict was delivered on July 9th. All 6 defendants were found guilty of murder and sentenced to hang by the neck until dead. The date was set for October 3rd. The silence in the courtroom following the sentence was heavy, broken only by the scratching of the court reporter's pen. The prisoners were marched back to the stockade to wait out the remaining months of their lives. August and September passed with agonizing slowness. The prisoners languished in the guardhouse. They could hear the sounds of the carpentry detail working nearby. The army engineers were constructing a gallows. It was a large structure built to accommodate 4 men simultaneously. The heavy timbers were hewn from the local pine forests, the smell of fresh sap drifting into the cells. The sight of the rising scaffold was a daily torture, a physical manifestation of the coming end. During this time, President Ulysses S. Grant reviewed the sentences. In a gesture of clemency that surprised many, he commuted the sentences of Barncho and Slowlooks to life imprisonment on Alcatraz Island, citing their youth and the fact that they had acted under orders. For Kintpoos, Shanchin John, Black Jim, and Boston Charlie, there would be no mercy. The sentence stood. October 3rd, 1873, dawned clear and cold. A frost lay on the parade ground of Fort Klamath, sparkling in the early morning light. The atmosphere at the post was tense and somber. Hundreds of people had gathered to witness the execution. Settlers had traveled for days by wagon from as far away as Eureka and Linkville, bringing picnic baskets and children, treating the event as a grim holiday. The Klamath Indians, traditional enemies of the Modocs, gathered in large numbers, eager to see the final destruction of their rivals. The entire garrison of the fort was turned out under arms, forming a hollow square around the gallows to prevent any last-minute rescue attempt or riot. Inside the guardhouse, the 4 condemned men were prepared for the end. Their chains were removed only to be replaced by binding ropes. Their arms were tied securely behind their backs. A chaplain spoke to them, offering Christian prayers, but the men remained stoic, adhering to their own beliefs or simply resigned to the void. Kintpoos asked for a final drink of whiskey, but it was denied. He refused to show fear. He told the officers that he was ready to die, that he was a man and would face his death standing up. Shanchin John, the old warrior who had fought for decades, seemed weary, ready to leave a world that had no place for him. Black Jim and Boston Charlie, younger and more volatile, struggled to maintain their composure, but ultimately walked out of the cell with their heads high. The procession to the gallows began at 10 o'clock in the morning. A wagon carried the prisoners to the scaffold, surrounded by a heavy guard of bayonets. The wheels of the wagon crunched on the frozen gravel. Kintpoos sat on his coffin, looking out at the sea of faces. He saw the settlers he had fought, the soldiers he had battled, and the traitors who had sold him out. He saw Hooker Jim in the crowd watching. Kintpoos did not shout or scream. He maintained a silence that was more powerful than any curse. He climbed the steps of the gallows steadily, the wood thumping under his boots. The four men were positioned on the long trapdoor, standing side by side. The executioner, a man whose face was hidden, adjusted the nooses. The ropes were thick, made of hemp, with heavy knots positioned behind the left ear to ensure a clean break of the neck. The rough fibers scratched against the skin of their necks. The gathered crowd fell silent. The wind rustled the pine trees, a lonely sound in the vast valley. The adjutant read the death warrant aloud, the legal language drifting over the heads of the condemned men. To be hanged by the neck until dead. The words were final, absolute. Black hoods were placed over their heads, shutting out the light of the sun and the faces of the crowd. The world was reduced to the darkness inside the hood and the sound of their own breathing. There were no final speeches from the gallows, only the low murmuring of the chaplain. The tension was excruciating. The executioner stepped back and grasped the lever. At approximately 10:20 in the morning, the signal was given. The lever was pulled. The trapdoor fell with a loud crash that echoed off the barracks walls. The four bodies dropped simultaneously, falling 6 feet before the ropes snapped tight. The timber of the gallows creaked under the sudden weight. The crowd gasped, a collective intake of breath. The bodies jerked and swayed, turning slowly in the breeze. Kintpoos, Shanchan John, Black Jim, and Boston Charlie died as they had lived in the last months of the war. Together, suspended between the earth they claimed and the sky that covered them. The medical officers waited for the requisite time, checking for pulses before declaring the men dead. The bodies were cut down and placed in the rough pine coffins that had served as their seats only minutes before. They were buried in a small cemetery near the fort, their graves unmarked or marked only with simple stones, segregated from the soldiers they had killed. The execution broke the final spirit of the Modoc resistance. The leaders were dead, their bodies returning to the soil of the Oregon country. But their spirits, according to the tribes watching, lingered in the cold wind that blew down from the mountains. The aftermath of the hanging was immediate and brutal for the survivors. The war was over, but the punishment of the innocent continued. The government had decided that the Modocs could never again be allowed to live in their homeland. The cost of the war, over $500,000, and the lives of nearly 80 soldiers and officers, including a general, was too high to risk a recurrence. The remaining 153 Modocs, the men, women, and children who had surrendered or been captured, were ordered to be exiled. On October 12th, the survivors were loaded onto wagons for the first leg of a journey that would take them thousands of miles away from the Tule Lake Basin. They were a broken people. The women cut their hair short in mourning, covering their faces with pitch and ash. The children, many of whom were orphans of the war, looked out from the wagons with wide, traumatized eyes. They traveled under heavy guard to the railhead at Redding, California. There they were herded into cattle cars, treated little better than the livestock that usually occupied the trains. The train journey was a nightmare of confinement and disorientation. They watched the landscape change from the mountains and forests of the West to the flat, endless plains of the interior. They were taken to Fort McPherson in Nebraska, and finally to the Quapaw Agency in the far northeastern corner of the Indian Territory, which would later become Oklahoma. It was a land completely alien to them. There were no lava beds, no tule marshes, no mountains. The air was humid and sickly, breeding malaria and other diseases that the high desert people had no immunity against. Hooker Jim and the scouts who had betrayed Kintpoos were not spared this fate. Despite their service to the army and the promises of amnesty, they were exiled along with the rest of the tribe. The government made no distinction between the loyal Modocs and the hostile Modocs once the guns were silent. They were all just Indians to be removed. Hooker Jim spent the rest of his life in exile, living among the people he had betrayed, carrying the weight of his actions until his death. The animosity between the two factions, the families of the hanged martyrs and the families of the traitors, festered for generations in the foreign land. Back in the lava beds, the silence returned. The soldiers packed up their tents at Gillam's camp and marched away. The stone walls of the stronghold began to crumble under the weight of the winter snows. The empty cartridges and the bones of the horses were bleached white by the sun, slowly disappearing into the volcanic dust. The ranchers returned to their cattle, grazing them over the ground where the battles had raged. The physical scars of the war remained, the mortar craters, the rifle pits, the graves at Sand Butte, but the human element was gone. The execution at Fort Klamath marked the definitive end of the Indian Wars in the California-Oregon borderlands. It was a victory for the United States, but a victory stained with the blood of a peace commission and the betrayal of the gallows. The image of Kientpoos swinging from the rope became a symbol of the ultimate tragedy of the Western expansion. A man pushed to the brink, forced to commit a terrible crime, and then destroyed by the inevitable crushing weight of a superior industrial power. The story of the Modoc War, from the first shot at Lost River to the drop of the trapdoor at Fort Klamath, stood as a testament to the grit and ferocity of a people who refused to vanish without a fight. They had turned a few square miles of rock into a fortress that held off an army, humiliating the military establishment and capturing the attention of a nation. In the end, they lost everything, their land, their leaders, and their freedom. But they left behind a legacy burned into the history of the West. The lava beds remained, a silent monument to the ghosts who had once walked through the fog, invincible and terrifying before the noose tightened and the long exile began. The wind continued to blow over the graves at Fort Klamath, whispering through the pines, carrying the story of the 4 men who died on that frosty October morning. It was a story of blood, lava, and the cold, hard justice of the frontier. The rope had finished what the howitzers could not, and the Modoc War passed from the realm of violent reality into the pages of history, leaving only the empty landscape and the echo of the trapdoor slamming shut.